His Cinderella in disguise.
Written by Edith Byrd and published by Starfall Publications. Enjoy.
Chapter 1. Marie. Hurry along, darling. The seamstress is waiting, and you know well enough that you must look your best this evening. Marie glanced up in time to see her stepsister Harriet's expression fall. But, Mother, I will be in disguise the entire night, she protested. What does it matter how I look? Marie stifled a chuckle at the irritated look on her stepmother's face. Bertha Parson, Dowager Countess of Dunwich, didn't appreciate it when anyone flouted her authority. While Harriet was the only person in the household who could get away with the smallest amount of rebellion, even she had her limits. Marie wasn't afforded the same luxury. Her stepmother took great delight in telling her what she could and could not do. "That's no excuse not to look your best," Bertha snapped. "You could very well catch the attention of an earl or even a duke tonight. Do you think he would pick you over all the other girls if you don't outshine them?" "But, Mother—" "Enough complaining," Bertha hissed. She clapped her hands, and 2 servants entered the room, followed closely by the seamstress. The woman had been making dresses for the Dunwich women since long before Marie's mother had died, and her skills were unmatched. As she curtsied to Bertha and Harriet, her expression was wary and cautious. Marie couldn't blame her. Her stepmother was a trying woman in the best of circumstances. Today she would be especially difficult. She was determined that the evening's ball would be where Harriet finally snagged herself a wealthy, titled husband. It was a matter of the utmost importance to the Dowager Countess. Marie's own marriage was of far less concern to her stepmother, however. She wouldn't be attending this masquerade or any other ball this season. Bertha had deemed it unnecessary. There was only one reason Marie could think of for the Dowager Countess, to keep her away from the eligible bachelors of high society. She'd already picked a husband for Marie herself. The thought wasn't a welcome one. Marie had no doubt her stepmother's choice would be a man with whom she had nothing in common. Within all probability, she wouldn't even be able to tolerate him. Of course, whether Marie liked her husband or not was of no concern to Bertha. Indeed, she would love nothing more than to see her stepdaughter miserable. She had made that perfectly clear over the years. "Could you not make yourself more useful?" Bertha suddenly snapped, yanking Marie from her thoughts. With a frown, Marie met her stepmother's dark brown gaze. "What do you mean?" "You are sitting there as silent as a bump on a log," Bertha hissed. "Would it be so difficult for you to encourage Harriet to attend tonight's ball?" Marie released a sigh. There was no pleasing Bertha. If she were more active and conversational, the Dowager Countess would accuse her of trying to steal attention away from Harriet. If Marie were to sit quietly, she accused her of laziness. "Apologies, stepmother," she said in a quiet voice. "I'll endeavour to do better." She met Harriet's eyes in the mirror as the seamstress dressed her. Harriet's gaze was sympathetic and even apologetic. Marie offered her a small smile and a tiny shrug. When Harriet was fully dressed, Bertha gushed, "Oh, you will be the most beautiful lady present tonight." She ordered Harriet to spin in a slow circle so she could see the full effect of the luxurious Venetian Bordeaux gown. It was a gorgeous dress, but it looked heavy on Harriet's thin frame. Still, it was so lovely Marie felt an unfortunate pang of jealousy that she couldn't wear it herself. "Get that pathetic look off your face," Bertha snapped, glaring at Marie. "You look like a dog denied its bone." Her words were no harsher than usual, but they struck Marie particularly hard, given everything the Dowager Countess denied her. Feeling tears gather in her eyes, Marie pushed to her feet. "Excuse me, please," she mumbled, lowering her head and dashing out of the room before Bertha could stop her. No doubt she'd pay for her hasty exit later, but all that mattered in this moment was that Bertha didn't see her cry. She made her way through the manor to her room, shutting the door firmly behind her before collapsing onto her bed to weep. How had her life come to this? Why must she be saddled with that horrible woman instead of the loving parents she missed every single day? How long must she endure this torment? It was some time later when she heard a knock on the door. "Go away!" she snapped, sitting up on her bed and swiping her hand over her eyes. She didn't want to see anyone, especially not Bertha. "It's me." Harriet's soft voice filtered through the door. "Please, may I come in?" Marie hesitated a moment but then said, "Very well." Harriet opened the door and slipped inside, closing it behind her. "Are you well?" she asked, hurrying across the room to sit next to Marie. She took her hand and squeezed it. "I'll be just fine," Marie assured her, although they both knew that was a lie. Harriet sighed. "I'm so sorry for what she said and how she treats you. It's not fair." Marie shrugged and forced a small, sad smile. "I'm used to it by now." "No, you aren't," Harriet murmured. They sat in companionable silence a moment before she said, "I have an idea, one that I think will benefit us both." Marie glanced at her with an arched brow. "Oh, what is that?" "What if you went to the ball tonight instead of me?" Marie's eyes widened with surprise. What do you mean? How?" Harriet's gaze lit up with excitement as she explained. "It'll be simple. It's a masquerade ball, after all. You'll wear my dress and mask, and no one will know you aren't me." Marie's heart raced at the idea, but she shook her head. "What about you? If you're not at the ball, where do you intend to be so your mother doesn't discover you?" A deep blush coloured Harriet's cheeks. "I will visit Gerard." Marie understood the full extent of her plan then. While she was posing as Harriet at the ball, her sister would sneak away to see her beloved. Gerard was the son of a merchant and had no title, so Harriet knew her mother would never approve of him. They stole moments together whenever they could, and it pained Marie that her stepsister had to hide her love in such a way. "Do you truly think it'll work?" she asked. She rarely dared to hope that things in her life would go well for her anymore, but this might prove worth the risk of heartache and disappointment. Harriet nodded her head. "Yes, I'm certain it will. You need only do exactly what I say." Chapter 2, Alexander. "Must I attend this wretched ball? You know it will be nothing but desperate young ladies pushed on to unsuspecting gentlemen by their scheming mothers." Alexander's father, Arnold Greene, Duke of Torwell, scoffed at his son's complaint. "Yes, you must go," he snapped. "It is high time you mingled in society. You are my son and heir, and there are certain responsibilities that come with your position and title, as you well know." Alexander sighed in his frustration. "Father, we've discussed this," he said. "I will assume my responsibilities in due time, but I see no need to do so any time soon. You're young yet and healthy. The title won't be mine for many years." "You are still a Marquess." His father shot to his feet from where he'd been sitting behind his desk. He'd called Alexander to his study on the pretense that he wished to discuss business matters. "You still represent this family, Alexander?" "That may very well be, father," Alexander replied, his jaw taut. "But why must I give up the last remains of my independence when it simply isn't necessary?" "Necessary?" His father looked baffled, as if he truly couldn't comprehend his son's logic. "There are few things absolutely necessary in order for you to fulfill the duties of your station. You must take your place in society, and you must marry and produce an heir." Alexander rubbed at his temples as he felt a headache beginning to form. "Is that why you're so insistent I attend tonight? You want me to find a bride at long last?" He wasn't a fool. He'd known that's what his father wanted from him. He just wanted to hear the old man say it out loud. With a heavy sigh, the Duke nodded. "Yes, that is why you must attend tonight's ball." Alexander ground his teeth in irritation. He loved his father and respected him more than any other man on earth. They thought much the same way, save for this particular issue. His father was eager for him to marry, settle down, and take his place in society. Alexander did not care what others thought of him, and he was even less interested in marrying. He wanted to enjoy being a bachelor before he had to marry and give up his freedom. "What if I refused to go?" he asked, testing how far he could push his father's patience. The Duke's mouth thinned into a hard line as he glared at his son. "If you refuse to go," he began, his voice deceptively calm, "if you refuse to do your duty as my heir, then I will have no recourse left but to cut you off." Alexander's brows shot up to his hairline as shock coursed through him. He had not expected such a drastic ultimatum. Though he did not think his father would carry through with his treat, Alexander decided it was probably best not to find out. "Very well," he grumbled, defeated. "I'll attend." His father looked relieved. Waving his hand, he said, "No gentleman enjoys these gatherings. That's not what they're about. And yet we drag ourselves to them anyway, in the hopes of making a name for ourselves." Alexander truly hated this part of society. He hated small talk and pretending to be interested in people who were simply too boring to bother with. He hated feeling like a hunted animal when he walked into a room filled with the marriage-minded mamas. Most of all, he hated the expectation that this was what the rest of his life was going to look like. If he had his way, he would retire to one of their country manors where he could hunt and practice his archery in peace. There was no running away from his obligations, however, no matter how much he may want to. He stared into his father's pleased face and knew that his capitulation had been inevitable. The moment he'd been born, his life had been laid out before him, and he'd had no choice but to follow that path. Now, even as a man of 26, his life was dictated by the stifling expectations of society and his station. He wished he could just reject it all, but in his heart knew he never would. Duty and honour and family kept him in check. "I am pleased you've decided to cooperate," his father told him, eyes sparkling with triumph and delight. Alexander begrudgingly nodded. "Indeed, father. What other choice did—" Chapter 3, Marie. "I don't think this is going to work, Harriet. There's no way she will be fooled." "Stop worrying," Harriet insisted, waving away Marie's anxious words with a flick of her wrist. "You look perfect. Just be sure to say as little as you can when you're around Mother, and don't take your mask off at any point. You'll be perfectly fine." It was the evening of the ball, and Harriet and Marie were putting their plan into motion. Harriet had recruited her lady's maid to help them. They had dressed Marie in the beautiful Venetian gown and matching mask, and stood in Harriet's room, putting the final touches on her toilet. The mask was an elaborate affair that thankfully covered the majority of her face. Only her lips, chin, and part of her nose were left uncovered. Despite the cover provided by the mask, and even though she and Harriet had a similar shade of brown hair, Marie was certain Bertha would recognise her instantly. "Harriet, I don't think—" Her stepsister took her by the shoulders and forced her to meet her gaze. "Marie, listen to me," she said in a calm, firm voice. "Everything will be all right. You deserve to be at that ball. If my mother won't allow you to go as yourself, then she has left us no choice. But we could find ourselves in such trouble." Harriet grinned. "That's part of the fun, don't you think? Now enough worrying. If you don't go in my place, I won't be able to see Gerard, and I shall never forgive you." Marie could not help but grin at her teasing tone. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "Very well. You're right. I'll stop worrying and enjoy myself." "That's the spirit," Harriet declared. She reached up and adjusted Marie's mask. "Now, we must get you downstairs before Mother comes looking for me. Abigail will escort you." Harriet gave Marie a quick hug and whispered, "I can't wait to hear all about it later." Smiling at her stepsister, Marie allowed Abigail to lead her out of the room and toward the second-floor landing. When she reached the top of the stairs, she gazed down to find Bertha smiling up at her. "Oh, my darling, you're exquisite." Her stepmother clapped with glee as Marie began descending toward her. "Did I not tell you that you'd look magnificent?" Marie nearly laughed at the absurdity of the situation. If Bertha knew who was really walking toward her, she'd never say such things. When she reached the bottom of the stairs and walked over to stand with Bertha, the Dowager Countess's eyes swept over her, and she felt a moment of panic, certain she'd be found out. It was a relief when Bertha merely smiled and said, "Are you ready to go, my dear?" Marie nodded, careful not to speak. Bertha frowned slightly. "Are you well, daughter?" Forcing a wide smile, Marie nodded. Thankfully, that response appeared enough for Bertha. She grinned and picked up her skirts. "Then let us be off." By the time they arrived at the assembly rooms, Marie's heart was racing. She was excited and terrified all at once. Walking into the vast venue, she was amazed by the grandeur of the house, as well as the glamour of the costumes of the other attendees. "This could be your life always, my dear," Bertha murmured as they walked side by side in the ball. "You need only choose the right man, and your life could be filled with luxury as you've never known." Marie nodded. Though it was not only her fear of being discovered that kept her silent, she was struck speechless by the splendour around her. "Come, Harriet. Let me introduce you to everyone." Bertha took her hand and began to lead her around the room. Marie was careful to follow Harriet's instructions on proper etiquette, curtsying and smiling while Bertha presented her to her acquaintances. As they moved around the room, Marie caught sight of a man dressed as a pirate, but without a mask. He was tall, with broad shoulders, jet black hair, and captivating dark blue eyes. She could not help but stare at him. He was easily the most beautiful man she had ever seen. "Who is that?" Bertha asked her friend, Lady Sharon, with whom she had been gossiping. She pointed to the black-haired man, as if she could read Harriet's mind. Lady Sharon's expression lit up with immediate interest. "Oh, that is Lord Greene, Marquess of Torwell," she replied in a conspirator's whisper. "He's one of the most sought-after bachelors in all of London." "Indeed?" Bertha stared at him intently for several moments, then said to her friend, "Won't you excuse us, Lady Sharon?" "Of course." Lady Sharon gave Bertha a knowing look. Grabbing Harriet's hand, her stepmother said, "Come with me, darling." To Harriet's complete shock and utter delight, Bertha began leading her toward the Marquess. Chapter 4. Alexander. Alexander fought not to sigh with boredom. He knew most men would give anything to be in his position, surrounded by a group of young ladies vying for his attention, but he was not interested in a single one of them. They were each lovely in their own way, but all rather ordinary. How much longer must I endure this farce before I can return home? At that moment he spotted a woman walking towards him with purpose. She held the hand of a young lady and appeared to be practically dragging the girl along with her. Another ambitious mother wishing to push her naive daughter onto me. The young lady was at least pretty, wearing a stunning Venetian gown, though most of her face was hidden behind her matching mask. The older woman shouldered her way through the small crowd around him and smiled up at him. "Lord Greene, I'm Lady Dunwich. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance." He had to admit she was rather bold, which actually piqued his interest. "The pleasure is all mine, Lady Dunwich." His eyes moved toward the girl trapped in her grasp. And who might this lovely creature be? Lady Dunwich beamed at the compliment. "This is my daughter, Lady Harriet." She subtly yanked the girl forward. Lady Harriet sank into a deep, somewhat clumsy curtsy, then gazed at him with a tentative smile. "Very nice to meet you, my lady," he said with a nod. She did not speak, merely nodded her head in return, then cast her eyes to the floor as if shy. It was something he found rather annoying in most women, but he found it oddly charming with her. "Oh my, is that Lord Warwick I see?" Lady Dunwich said, her gaze locked on something across the room. Turning her attention back to Alexander, she continued, "Do excuse me, my lord. I must pay my respects, but I leave my daughter to keep you company until I return." Ah, and there is her trap. Instead of confronting her for the thinly veiled attempt at matchmaking, he let her go with a nod and a smile. Once she was well out of earshot, he turned back to Lady Harriet. "How are you enjoying yourself this evening?" To his surprise, she looked up at him with a wide smile. It was as if some veil had been lifted off her, and he found himself rather stunned. "I'm having a marvellous time," she replied, her voice sweet and melodic. "Everything is so beautiful and bright." He grinned, her excitement infectious. "If only I could see your face. I'm sure it would make our surroundings even more brilliant." A blush spread across her half-covered cheeks, and it was clear she was pleased by his compliment. "That's very kind of you, my lord." He glanced from her to the dance floor and back again. Holding out his hand, he asked, "May I have the pleasure of a dance?" Her smile widened, and he found he rather liked being the cause of her happiness. She slipped her small hand into his and said, "You may." Wrapping his fingers around her, he led her to the dance floor. Holding her hand tight, he rested his other hand on her waist, and they began to circle around the room. "How have I not met you before?" he asked, his curiosity growing. "Oh, well," she appeared to be briefly looking for an answer. "I am rarely able to attend such events, and my mother is rather protective." It was a strange answer, as her mother had seemed very eager to push her onto the first available bachelor she could find. He did not want to pry, however, and possibly chase her away. "What sorts of activities do you enjoy, my lady?" he asked, deciding to steer things toward a more general topic. She appeared relieved and happily answered, "I enjoy all types of things, my lord. Horseback riding, reading, dancing, though I must confess my favourite pastime is archery." He gaped. "Truly, that's a rather wonderful coincidence, as it is my favourite pastime as well." Her eyes lit up. "That is a wonderful coincidence." They fell into a lively conversation about the sport, and Alexander felt a strange fluttering of excitement erupt in his belly. He had never met a lady as passionate about archery as himself. It was a strange kind of joy to be able to talk to someone who truly understood him in this way. The two stayed together for the rest of the evening, talking and dancing and finding they had much in common. Alexander was stunned at how easily their conversation flowed. There were no awkward pauses or struggles to find a topic of conversation. He wished she would remove her mask so he could see her. He was certain she was beautiful, but was dying of curiosity to see her face. She never revealed it, however, and the few times he hinted at her removing her mask. She brushed his comments aside and continued on as if she did not understand what he was hoping for. Aside from that one issue, however, the night was remarkable. He had not expected to be so taken with anyone, and thought he should perhaps apologize to his father for resisting attending the ball. Meeting Lady Harriet was a stroke of good fortune. Eventually, however, Lady Dunwich found them again, and informed Lady Harriet that they were soon to depart. Alexander was not ready to let her go. "Lady Harriet," he said quickly before she could walk away, "may I write to you?" Her beautiful hazel eyes brightened with delight. "Yes, my lord," she replied, her voice a little breathless. "I would like that very much." Alexander smiled at her, relieved that she had said yes. "Then I look forward to speaking to you again," he said with a nod. She dipped into a curtsy. "Goodbye, my lord." "Goodbye, Lady Harriet." Chapter 5. Marie. "That was a rousing success, my dear," Bertha gushed as their carriage took them home. "I'm so very proud of you." Marie nodded and smiled, but said not a word. Her heart was aflutter, her mind filled with thoughts of Lord Greene. Their time together had been like a dream, one she had not wanted to wake from. "I knew you could attract the attention of someone of great status," Bertha declared, her excitement and delight completely at odds with her usual manner towards Marie. Smiling, Marie nodded. She could see outside the carriage window that they were reaching their estate, and she nearly sighed with relief. The sooner she was away from her stepmother, the better. She did not know how much longer she could keep up her facade. "Well, tell me, my dear, did you enjoy the ball? What was the Marquess like?" Bertha gazed at her with an expectant expression, and Marie realised she could not avoid answering her question. Mimicking Harriet's voice as best as she could, she replied, "The ball was lovely, and the Marquess a very respectable gentleman." She did not dare say more, as she feared Bertha would notice the difference in her voice. Thankfully, the Dowager Countess appeared as oblivious as she had been all night. As per usual, she'd imbibed generously of the punch, and her smile was wide as she nodded. "Oh, that is wonderful, my dear. I'm so very excited for the potential such a match could hold for you." Marie maintained her smile, even as her heart beat wildly in her chest. The idea of being with the Marquess had her stomach fluttering, but she quickly pushed the feeling away. "I must remember he thinks he met Harriet this evening. If he is interested in anyone, it is her." The fluttering stopped and was replaced by a heavy sense of disappointment. Though the night had been a fairy tale, her real life awaited her, and it was not so magical. When the carriage came to a stop, the two ladies were assisted out and made their way into the manor. Before Bertha could say a word, Marie murmured, "Please excuse me, Mother, I need to change. This dress is rather heavy." Bertha nodded. "Of course. Sleep well, my dear." Marie turned from her stepmother and hurried up the stairs. She did not dare stop or remove her mask before she reached her chambers. Opening the door, she slipped inside and found Harriet sitting on her bed, waiting for her, just as they had planned. Her lady's maid was with her as well. "How was it?" Harriet asked, pushing to her feet with a wide smile. Marie finally untied her mask and pulled it from her face. She could not stop the wide smile that curled her lips. "Oh, Harriet," she breathed. "It was wonderful." Harriet clapped her hands together. "I'm so happy. Now you must tell me everything of import should Mother question me or make reference to the night." While the lady's maid helped Marie undress, she quickly told Harriet all that she could about the night, including her encounter with Lord Greene. "Your mother is going to want to know more about him," she warned. "She was very excited that he spent so much time with me." Harriet blanched. "I hadn't expected you to meet a gentleman. Marie, how in the world did you think this would work? What if Mother forces me to court a man I've never actually met?" "It'll be all right," Marie assured her, though the thought had crossed her mind as well, causing her worry. "There's no time to dwell on that now. You need to get back to your room with the dress before your mother decides to check on you, as she usually does." Harriet appeared hesitant, but she nodded. "You're right, but please promise me we'll talk more about this tomorrow." "I promise." Marie watched as Harriet and her lady's maid collected the dress and hurried from the room. Before they slipped out into the hallway, however, she asked, "How was your evening?" Harriet paused and glanced back at her with a shy smile and a dark blush. "It was lovely," she admitted. "It was so good to see Gerard. Thank you, Marie, for switching places with me." Marie felt a warm sense of contentment settle over her. Despite the complications, she was happy that Harriet had been able to be with her love. "You're welcome, Harriet." Her stepsister gave her a last lingering look, her gratitude clear in her eyes, before she turned and disappeared out into the corridor. Chapter 6. Alexander. Alexander could not get Lady Harriet out of his mind. She had somehow mesmerised him as no woman before her had been able to. He sat gazing out of the parlour window as his parents discussed some matter he could not make himself pay attention to. They were all having tea together, a daily occurrence his mother insisted on whenever they were all home together. Alexander did not mind the time he spent with his parents. Usually he rather enjoyed it, but today he was anxious to be alone again, so he could pen his first letter to Lady Harriet. "Darling, are you all right?" his mother asked, pulling him from his musings. "You are very quiet today." Alexander smiled at her. "I apologize, Mother. My mind is elsewhere." "Could it be with that lovely young lady you spent nearly the whole night with?" his father asked with a teasing grin. His mother's eyes widened. "A lady? What lady? You didn't tell me you'd met someone last night, Alexander." He released a breath, but he could not truly be annoyed with his father. In truth, he was far too delighted with Lady Harriet to allow for anything to sour his mood. "Her name was Lady Harriet. Her mother, Lady Dunwich, introduced us." Dunwich. His father appeared to consider the name for a thoughtful moment. "The Earl of Dunwich's widow?" Alexander shrugged. "I suppose she was." The Duke said, "A good man, cut down too soon. I believe the current Dowager Countess is his second wife, and Lady Harriet his stepdaughter." "Whatever her parentage, she was delightful," Alexander said. "Beautiful and intelligent, charming beyond words, and she possesses a love of archery that rivals my own." His mother's expression lit up with joy. "She sounds marvellous, darling." "I believe she is," Alexander smiled. "Do you have plans to see each other again?" his father asked. "Not as of yet, but she said I may write to her." "Oh, have you sent her anything?" his mother asked. Her obvious excitement was understandable, as Alexander had never shown such interest in a woman before. He shook his head. "Not yet." "You must do so, then," her mother exclaimed. Both he and the Duke stared at her in surprise. "If this young lady is truly as wonderful as you claim, then you must not waste any time. Another gentleman could come along and snatch her up before you get the chance." Alexander had not considered that. "You're right, Mother. I will write to her immediately." Pushing to his feet, he excused himself from his smiling parents and went to his rooms. Sitting at his writing desk, he took up pen and paper and wrote a quick letter to Lady Harriet. "Lady Harriet, I hope my letter finds you well. I wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed our meeting last night, and that I hope it is not the last we will see of each other." He included in his letter all the reasons the evening had been memorable for him, and while he desperately wished to extend some invitation to meet with her in person, he restrained himself. First, he needed a better sense of her feelings, and if she would be receptive to meeting in person. Once he had finished his letter, he was filled with an anxious energy that he needed to burn away. He decided to go riding. A healthy sweat would help him regain his sense of calm. Leaving his rooms once again, he made his way out of the house and toward the stables. As he was leaving, he handed his letter to the butler to be sent in the next post. He was already eager for Lady Harriet's reply. Once his horse was saddled and readied for him, he mounted, and after warming his mount up with a light trot until he was out in the open, he let the beast run to its heart's content. The pace was brutal but invigorating as the wind whipped against his face and tugged at his clothes. Despite the thrill of his ride, his mind could not seem to stray far from Lady Harriet for very long. He remembered how sweet her voice had been when she had finally spoken to him, how lovely her smile was, the graceful way she had walked about the room, as though she floated through the air, her feet not touching the floor. As physically lovely as she had been, though, her mind was what fascinated him the most. She had a wit and intelligence that challenged and delighted him. She had not been afraid to critique or correct him when he had said something she did not agree with, and that was wildly refreshing. He prayed she responded to his letter, prayed he would see her again. "Lady Harriet, you have captured my attention, and I am eager to discover everything I can about you." Chapter 7, Marie. "Now, tell me everything," Harriet said in a conspiratorial whisper. She and Marie sat together in the garden, away from Bertha's prying eyes. Marie could not help but smile as she recalled all she could about the Marquess. "He is so handsome," perhaps the most handsome man I've ever seen," she began. "He was charming and intelligent, and he spoke to me as though he truly cared about my thoughts and opinions." Harriet grinned. "He sounds wonderful." Marie sighed. "A part of me believes he was only a dream. The whole evening feels as though it was a fantasy." "I'm so glad you were able to go," Harriet said, taking Marie's hand in her own. "What about your evening?" Marie asked, shifting focus to her stepsister. "How was Gerard?" Harriet's eyes sparkled with her obvious love for the man. "It was one of the most amazing nights of my life," she confessed in a breathless voice. "We sat outside and watched the stars and talked for hours. I've never been able to talk with someone the way I can with Gerard." Marie was happy for Harriet. She had found a man to love who loved her just as fiercely. It was not fair that Bertha would look down on him, however, simply because he was not titled. As happy as Marie was for Harriet, she was also sad for her, knowing she could not be with Gerard openly. At the sound of gravel crunching, both women glanced up, tensing. When a footman appeared, Marie released a breath of relief, thankful it was not Bertha. The footman looked at Harriet and said, "My lady, a letter has arrived for you." He handed her the missive, then bowed and left them alone once more. Frowning, Harriet opened the letter and ran her eyes along its contents, her gaze going wide. I don't believe this letter is for me," she murmured, glancing toward Marie. "Oh," Marie furrowed her brow. "Why would you say that?" "Because it's from Lord Greene." Marie gasped, her heart thudding with instant excitement. "What does it say?" She reached for the letter, and Harriet handed it to her without hesitation. As she read his words, she lost her breath. It was the most romantic letter she could have imagined. He spoke of their night together, and all the moments he thought had been particularly wonderful. Her fingers curled into the paper, wrinkling it. "It's so sweet," Harriet sighed. "You made quite the impression on him." "I suppose," Marie murmured. "I don't know how, though. He never even saw my face." Harriet chuckled. "That's even better. It's not your beauty that's transfixed him, but your mind." "He thinks I'm you," Marie pointed out. Harriet arched a brow and appeared thoughtful. Yes. That is a sticking point, I suppose, though not an impossible obstacle to overcome if we put our heads together." Marie opened her mouth to respond to Harriet's enthusiastic assurances, but the sound of footsteps approaching again made her hesitate. The next moment Bertha rounded the corner and stood before them. "Ah, here you are, my dear," she said, her gaze locked on Harriet as she ignored Marie. "Come, I thought you and I could go do a little shopping for fabrics and lace and have you fitted for some new dresses today." Harriet frowned. "For what reason, Mother? We only recently refreshed my wardrobe with several lovely dresses and those will not be good enough should the Marquess of Torwell come calling, which I have no doubt he will." Bertha beamed. "You two got on so well at the ball. I'm sure he's positively smitten with you already." Marie and Harriet exchanged a glance. Marie kept her lips sealed tightly shut, afraid she might say something, and accidentally let slip the truth about their ruse. Her heart thudded at the idea of him calling at the house, a prospect that was both exciting and terrifying. "If he does call, it won't be me who sits with him in the parlour." "Don't dawdle, let's go now," Bertha insisted, waving her hand at Harriet. Her stepsister looked to her again, and Marie gave her a subtle nod. With a sigh, Harriet pushed to her feet. "Very well, Mother, let's go." Bertha looked thoroughly pleased with herself as she led Harriet away. Marie watched them go, her heart sinking. It should be her off to buy material for new dresses in hopes of impressing Lord Greene. The fact that it was not, that such a thing was not even possible, filled her with frustration and anger. Shoving to her feet, she made her way back to the house, careful not to catch up to Bertha and Harriet, and asked one of the servants to ready her archery equipment. She needed to burn off some of her anxious energy. When everything was set up, she took her bow in hand and fitted it with an arrow. She focused on her target, took a deep breath, and released. The satisfying twang of her bowstring instantly calmed her, as did the thunk of the arrow hitting its goal. She imagined practicing with Lord Greene, and her cheeks fluted with heat as her lips twitched into a grin. Despite the impossibility of the meeting again, she was thrilled that such a dashing gentleman had been interested in her at all. Marie was not used to receiving gentlemen's attention, and so felt giddy with excitement at the prospect that he wished to see her again. Though it isn't I that he wishes to see, it's Harriet. The thought sat on her chest like a weight, throwing her next shot just off target. Chapter 8. Alexander. She wrote to him. He had been afraid she would not reply to his letter, that she had not been as taken with him as he had been with her. When the butler had handed him her letter at breakfast, he had felt such a wave of relief, he had nearly laughed out loud. Dear Lord Greene, I was so delighted to receive your letter. It filled my heart with such joy I cannot truly express it in words. There are so many moments from the ball that I will cherish for the remainder of my days, but none more so than our meeting. Her words were so sweet and pure, and they made his chest swell with warmth and delight. She is far too good for me. An angel, deserving more than a mere mortal man. You look happy, darling, his mother commented, distracting him from Lady Harriet's letter. Have you received good news of some kind? Alexander smiled across the breakfast table, meeting the Duchess's gaze. They always took their morning meal together, and sometimes the Duke joined them, but today he was busy. He and Alexander had plans to go hunting later, a pastime they both enjoyed. I have, he nodded. It appears my interest in the young lady I met at the ball may be reciprocated. His mother's eyes lit up with delight. Oh, that's wonderful. Do you have plans to see her again? Not yet, but I would very much like to. And he would. He would write to her immediately and ask if he could call on her. Now that he had a better sense of her feelings, he was eager to be back in her presence again. I'm so happy you finally made this leap, she declared, clapping her hands together. I was beginning to worry that you might never show interest in a lady or make the effort to get to know one. It would have been a legitimate worry on her part, as he had never before had the desire to pay attention to any one lady. It was different with Lady Harriet, though. She fascinated him in a way he had never experienced before. Unable to wait a moment more to write to her, Alexander excused himself and bounded up the stairs to his room, feeling giddy as a boy. Your mother tells me you are quite taken with the late Lord Dunwich's stepdaughter, the Duke said later, as they walked together through the open field at the back of their estate, rifles tucked over their arms. Alexander shook his head but grinned. Mother certainly doesn't waste any time, does she? His father chuckled. Not when she sees the hope of grandchildren shining for the very first time. Alexander did not think he would go quite so far with his infatuation with Lady Harriet quite yet, but he found he was open to the possibility of a future with her. It was not an insignificant thing for him. I've written to her asking if I may call on her, he confessed. He had sent his letter early enough in the day that he might yet get a response. He had been pacing with anticipation, driving his mother and everyone else around him mad. Hunting was proving a decent distraction, though he was eager to return to the house soon to see if a reply waited for him. I'm sure she will be just as eager to see you again as you are her, his father said, patting him on his shoulder. I certainly hope so, Alexander murmured. His mind was a whirl with anxiety and hope that she would write back. He did not want to cheat his father of this time together, however, so he forced his thoughts of Lady Harriet aside so he could enjoy the hunt and relax with the Duke. When they arrived back at the manor several hours later, Alexander was thrilled to find a letter waiting for him. He took it from the butler with hurried thanks, then made his way up to his room so that he could read away from prying eyes. Her penmanship was a lovely sight to behold, as were her words. Dear Lord Greene, I cannot tell you how delighted I am that you wish to see me again. If you do not have any pressing engagements, I would like to invite you to join me for tea tomorrow afternoon at my family's estate. I think it would be lovely to be able to speak face to face rather than only through paper and ink. I look forward to your reply and shall hopefully see you tomorrow. Yours sincerely, Lady Harriet. She wanted to see him. She wanted to see him tomorrow. I will finally see her face. I'm certain she is as beautiful as her voice and words would suggest. Whether she was Venus incarnate or somehow ill-formed, he did not think it would ultimately matter to him. Lady Harriet had already enthralled him, and he did not think there was anything that could sway his heart. Chapter 9. Marie. He was to arrive at any moment. She was both excited and terrified, and wondered, not for the first time, if this plan she and Harriet had concocted would work. Marie had been so heartsick after her archery practice the day before that she had written a response to his first letter, even as she told herself it was foolish. When he had replied requesting to see her again, Harriet had insisted she invite him for tea. Their plan was simple. Bertha was to be out of the house, taking a stroll with her friend Lady Sharon. Marie would answer the door when he arrived and act as chaperone for Harriet so that they were all in the same room together. Then she would try to charm him as she had at the ball, so his interest transferred from Harriet to her. It shouldn't prove too difficult, and yet her heart was thundering as if she were about to walk onto a battlefield. She stood in the parlour with Harriet, waiting for him to arrive. "If you don't stop pacing, you'll make yourself dizzy," her stepsister said, her tone teasing. Marie glanced at her but didn't stop moving. "I can't be still," she insisted. "I'm too nervous." "Fear not. Our plan will work," Harriet assured her. "What could possibly go wrong?" As if Harriet's words had summoned her, Bertha suddenly came sweeping into the room. Both sisters stared at her, stunned. "Mother, what are you doing here?" Harriet asked, jumping to her feet. "It's far too chilly to enjoy a walk today," Bertha explained with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Besides, how could I miss Lord Greene's first visit to our home?" Her eyes landed on Marie and narrowed as she scowled. "What are you doing here?" "Marie was going to act as my chaperone," Harriet hurried to explain, stepping in front of Marie as if to shield her from Bertha. "I thought she and Lord Greene might also get along." "Well, that won't be necessary anymore," Bertha snapped. "You may leave." Marie looked at Harriet desperately, but her stepsister appeared at a loss for what to do. With no other choice, she begrudgingly walked out of the room and toward the stairs. As he was ascending to the second floor, she heard footsteps chasing after her. "Marie, wait!" She turned to find Harriet hurrying toward her. Marie frowned. "What are you doing?" "I told Mother I'd forgotten something in my room." She took Marie's hand and stopped her on the stairs. "I don't have to meet with him. I could say I feel unwell." Marie shook her head. "That won't work. Your mother has seen you and would know it isn't true. You must meet him." "But what about you?" In truth, Marie was not sure what she should do. There was no chance she'd be able to talk to him. If she could just see him, though, it might satisfy her until they were able to come up with a new plan. A sudden idea dawned on her. "I'll hide and watch you," she said in a low voice. "I can stand in that stretch of tunnel behind the wall and peep through the spy hole." Marie had discovered all the secret tunnels and rooms within the house when she'd been a little girl. Sometimes she still used them to escape and hide from Bertha when her stepmother was being particularly difficult. Harriet looked hesitant but nodded. "Very well. If you're certain that will be enough." Marie took her hands and squeezed. "Yes, it will be. It will have to be." "Harriet! Where have you gone, my dear?" Bertha called from the parlour. Releasing a heavy sigh, Harriet said, "I must go. Find me after and we'll talk." "I will," Marie agreed. "Thank you." They parted ways, Harriet returning to her mother, and Marie hurrying to the secret door that would grant her entrance to the hideaway behind the wall. She glanced around to make sure no one saw her before pressing on the wall panel that swung open to reveal the opening. Just as she stepped over the threshold into the tunnel, there was a loud knock at the front door. Her heart skipped a beat. He's here. She heard footsteps hurrying from the parlour, no doubt Bertha intent on answering the door, so Marie slipped fully into the tunnel and shut the door behind her. She hurried down to the spy hole and peered through. Nearly the entire room was in view, and she waited with bated breath for Alexander to walk into the room. Moments later, Bertha appeared with a wide grin stretching her lips. Following close behind her was Lord Greene. "He's even more handsome than I remember." He smiled when he saw Harriet, and Marie felt a spike of jealousy stab through her. She forced it down, reminding herself that this was her own doing and not her stepsister's. The three sat together and engaged in what seemed a pleasant enough conversation, though Marie had a difficult time focusing on their words. Does he realise it's not me? Can he tell? A part of her hoped he could. That he'd instinctively know that the woman sitting before him was not the one he'd met during the ball. She couldn't tell, though, by watching him. He seemed entirely engaged by Harriet. The visit ended far too soon for Marie's liking. Lord Greene stood and bowed, thanking the ladies for a pleasant afternoon, and then he was gone. Marie swallowed her disappointment as she made her way back out of the tunnel. In her heart she knew this was how it had to be, but she had not anticipated the experience to be quite so painful. "Marie." She jumped at Harriet's hiss, turning around to face her stepsister who had bustled out of the parlour to find her. "Well done, Harriet," she began with a forced smile. "I don't think he could tell." "You cannot make me do that again," Harriet interrupted her, surprising her. "It was far too stressful. I thought I might faint at any moment." Marie frowned. "But you must." How else would she see him again? Harriet shook her head. "No, it was awkward and painful. I had no idea what to discuss with him." Marie felt a small fissure of panic rush through her chest. She couldn't let this one opportunity to be close to him slip through her fingers. She needed to convince Harriet not to give up so quickly. "I will be with you next time," she promised. "We'll figure out a way to insist on my presence. Please, Harriet. I am desperate to see him again." Harriet regarded her for several long moments, then heaved a heavy sigh. "Oh, very well," she grumbled. "But I will only see him if you're with me. Agreed?" Marie nodded eagerly. "Agreed." Harriet shook her head. "I hope you know the mess this could become." "I do," Marie assured her, though she left out the fact that she simply did not care. Chapter 10, Alexander. "How was tea with Lady Harriet, darling?" his mother eagerly asked him that night as they enjoyed dinner together. "Oh, it was very pleasant," Alexander replied, trying to sound as enthusiastic as he had that morning before he'd gone to visit. His mother's smile dropped slightly. "Pleasant, is that all?" "It was somewhat awkward," he hedged. "The night of the ball was so enchanting with the masks and dancing. Moving to the real world was bound to have bumps." "Was she as charming as you recalled?" his father asked from his place at the head of the table. "Yes," Alexander replied, though that wasn't entirely true. "Very charming." His parents shared a concerned glance. He nearly sighed in disappointment. While he had enjoyed Lady Harriet's company, something had felt off. She had seemed different from the night of the ball, and even from the letters she had written to him. He'd wondered if her mother's presence had made her nervous. That explanation he could understand to a degree, as Lady Dunwich had a rather overwhelming personality. He remembered that it had been the same at the ball. She had not truly come to life until her mother had walked away. That realization gave him a little bit of hope. If he could meet her again without her mother being present, she might return to the engaging, delightful creature she had been upon their first meeting. He was suddenly eager to see her again under such circumstances and shoved to his feet. His parents gazed up at him with wide, startled eyes. "I must write a letter," he explained. "It cannot wait." His mother's lips curled up into a knowing grin. "Very well, dear. You may be excused, but I do expect better manners from you in the future." He walked to his mother's side and placed a kiss upon her cheek. "Of course. Thank you, Mother."
Thank you for watching. Before we continue into the story, make us a favor. Hit the subscribe button. This way we will be able to create more audiobooks for free for you. Thank you again. Now, back to our story.
He hurried from the room to his chambers to write a new letter to her, this time inviting her to his home, hoping she would be able to come without her mother. As soon as he had penned the letter, he dispatched it immediately. The rest of his day was spent in anxious anticipation of her reply. He was certain his initial impression of her had been the correct one, and that as soon as they could speak without the cloying presence of her mother, all would be well again. Alexander tried to distract himself with various activities, including archery. That proved rather counterproductive to his goal, however, as he only thought of her more as he sent arrow after arrow winging toward his target. He wondered if she was also practicing her archery today, and thought perhaps that could be an activity for them to enjoy together in a future outing. He determined to propose it to her if and when she accepted his invitation to tea. Evening came, and still he received no reply. He began to worry he had already ruined things up between them, and his increasing anxiety made it difficult to focus on the chess game he was playing with his father. "Son, it's been quite some time since you've played this poorly," the Duke chuckled. "Is there something on your mind?" Alexander scratched at his chin and tried to force his mind to concentrate before his father took his king. "Nothing of significance," he lied, moving one of his rooks and realizing too late he had walked right into a trap. His father swiped the piece from the board, a knowing smile curling his lips. "I must say, son, I'm very proud of you," he said. "You're finally doing right by your position. It is a relief, if I am honest." Alexander shook his head. "It's not about doing what is right by my position, father. Lady Harriet is special." At least, he hoped she was, and that he had not been mistaken about her at the ball. His father nodded. "It's a rare thing to find a woman who can make you rethink the way you live your life. You must secure her if she is as special as you say before someone else comes along and wins her heart first." Alexander knew his father was right. If he was serious about Lady Harriet, he needed to move quickly, yet he was hesitant after their most recent encounter. He prayed she responded to his letter and accepted his invitation for tea. He had to see her again. Had to talk to her again. He had to know for certain that she was worth the pursuit before he made a mistake he could not undo. Chapter 11. Marie. Marie stared at Lord Greene's latest letter, her stomach twisting with guilt and worry, and with longing. He was inviting her to tea, or rather he was inviting Harriet to tea, and that was the problem. As desperate as she was to see him again and to actually talk to him, she did not know that she could continue the ruse for much longer. What will I do if he gazes at Harriet with adoration? How will I hold my tongue? In her heart she knew she should tell him the truth, yet fear trickled into the back of her mind. She worried that he would be angry and not wish to see her ever again. What am I to do? Whatever she decided, she could not deny that she still wished to see him again. She would accept his invitation and find some way for her to accompany Harriet to his home. Her stepsister would not be hard to convince. It would be Bertha who would prove the obstacle to her plans. Taking up pen and paper, she penned her acceptance of his invitation. She would deal with Bertha when the time was right. "Mother, I won't go unless Marie can join me," Harriet insisted the next morning as they all sat together for breakfast. She had told Bertha of Lord Greene's invitation. She had asked if Marie could join her, and Bertha had immediately said no. Harriet was putting her foot down, and Marie watched the exchange with bated breath. Bertha frowned at her daughter. "Why on earth would you want Marie to be with you?" "I feel more relaxed when she's around me," Harriet explained. "I was so nervous the last time I met with him, I'm afraid I left a bad impression. Having Marie there will help me." Bertha scowled, but to Marie's relief she released a heavy sigh and said, "Very well. If she doesn't ruin things by speaking, she may go with you." Marie frowned. "How would I ruin things by speaking?" Bertha cast her a cold look. "Your ability to communicate is mediocre at best. I don't want Lord Greene to think that Harriet is as slow-witted as you are, so keep your mouth shut." She chuckled at her own mean remark, and Marie felt tears gather within her eyes. Why must she treat me with such disdain? What did I do to deserve this? "Mother," Harriet snapped, "why do you have to say such cruel things to Marie?" Bertha merely arched a brow. "If it is cruel to tell the truth, then I insist on being honest." Marie shoved to her feet and ran from the room before she broke into sobs in front of Bertha. Harriet called out to her, but she ignored her stepsister. She ran up to her room and threw herself onto her bed, letting her tears run free. She did not know how long she stayed there, crying on her bed, but Harriet came to find her eventually. Sitting on the bed next to her, Harriet rested her hand on Marie's back and rubbed it gently. "I'm sorry Mother said those things," she murmured. "She shouldn't be that way with you." Marie buried her face into her bedding. "Why does she hate me?" "I don't know," Harriet replied. "I don't understand anything that she does anymore." Marie sat up and wiped at her face with her hand. "I suppose I should at least be grateful she's allowing me to go with you," she murmured. Harriet wrapped her arm around Marie's shoulder and squeezed. "Yes, just think of that. Think of the fact that you'll get to see your Lord Greene today. All will be well, I promise." Marie smiled at her stepsister, finding some comfort in her words. She was right, after all. She simply needed to think of Lord Greene, and her heart would be filled with hope again. "You must calm yourself," Harriet said with a teasing grin. "He'll notice if you pace a hole into his floor." Marie nodded, but her feet wouldn't stop moving. It was later in the day, and the two women had just arrived at the Duke of Torwell's manor for their visit with Lord Greene. Marie was so nervous she thought she might be sick. Suddenly she heard footsteps approaching the parlour they waited in. Letting out a little gasp, she hurried to sit next to Harriet, taking a deep breath to calm her racing heart. Harriet reached over and patted her hand, offering some small comfort. The next moment Lord Greene strode into the room, and Marie lost her breath. He was so handsome. He almost did not seem real to her. The woman stood to greet him as he came to a stop in front of them. "Good day, ladies," he said with a bow. Straightening, he looked to Harriet. "It's good to see you again, Lady Harriet." Harriet dropped into a curtsy. "It's good to see you again as well, my lord. Please allow me to introduce my stepsister, Lady Marie." He arched a brow as Marie curtsied. "Can he tell who I am? Can he sense the connection between us?" That was likely a fanciful notion on her part. The silly musings of a silly woman. Still, when she straightened, he was staring at her curiously. "Shall we sit, my lord?" Harriet asked. As if snapping out of a daze, Lord Greene blinked and quickly turned to Harriet with a nod. The three settled around a beautiful tea that had been set out for them. Marie's heart raced and her mouth felt dry. She did not know what she should say to him. "I was very happy to receive your invitation for today," Harriet began, breaking the silence that had started stretching between them. "Oh, yes," Lord Greene replied, turning his gaze from Marie to Harriet. "I was eager to see you again." Marie sat silently as he and Harriet spoke, feeling awkward and out of place. After a while, however, she noticed he kept glancing toward her, as if he could not help himself. She bit her lip to hide her smile, but she was not able to hide her blush. "My lord, Lady Marie rather enjoys archery as well," Harriet suddenly said, turning to look at Marie. "Don't you, dear?" Seizing on the opportunity her stepsister was presenting her, Marie nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, I do, very much." He smiled and leaned forward. Her blood hummed when he said, "I'd love to discuss it with you." And so they did, and Marie felt herself falling in love with him with each moment that passed. Their conversation was lively, and she was wooed by his wit and charm. The fact that he was so handsome did not hurt matters by any means. "Are you also enjoying riding, Lady Marie?" She nodded enthusiastically. "I do, very much." He grinned. "You're quite the sportswoman." She felt a blush colour her cheeks as she replied, "I simply feel at ease when I am able to focus my energy into productive pursuits. The thrill one feels on the back of a horse is unmatchable. I love it nearly as much as the ache I feel in my shoulders after a long practice at archery, for it is proof that I have exerted myself." His expression appeared nearly awed as he nodded. "Indeed, I feel the exact same way." As the afternoon wore on, Marie felt as though she were flying. It was the most remarkable thing, talking to him and realizing she was falling for him. Yet no matter how thrilled she was that they seemed to be fitting well together, the experience was shadowed by the lie hanging over them. When all was said and done, she still was not the one he believed himself enchanted by. She either needed to reveal the truth to him or end it before her heart was broken. Chapter 12. Alexander. He stared out the window of his room, his mind troubled as he recalled his visit with Lady Harriet and her sister the day before. Alexander could not help but feel puzzled. Lady Harriet seemed so different in person than how she was in her letters. It was not that he did not like her by any means. She was intelligent and lovely, and had a quick wit that he enjoyed. She just was not all he had imagined, and he could not help but feel disappointment at that. Lady Marie, however, seems much more like the woman I have been writing to. It was the strangest thing, but he had so enjoyed speaking with Lady Marie, even more so than Lady Harriet. She was also intelligent, witty, and lovely, but their interests were much more aligned, and he had felt inexplicably drawn to her when he had first laid eyes on her. Guilt swirled within him. Though they were not formally courting, he felt as though he betrayed Lady Harriet when he had such thoughts about her sister. It was likely my mind playing tricks on me. I was so nervous about speaking with Lady Harriet again that I found it difficult to do so. That is all. He would not give it another thought. His interest was with Lady Harriet, and he would continue to focus his attention on her. Knocking his fist against the windowsill, he nodded to himself and turned toward the door. Making his way down to the dining room, he found his parents already at the table enjoying their breakfast. His mother smiled up at him, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "My dear, you have a letter this morning." He chuckled at her exuberance. "I do?" She nodded, looking very much like a child on Christmas morning. "It's by your plate. I'm certain it's from Lady Harriet." Alexander moved to his place where the letter sat waiting for him. His excitement for it was not quite so intense as it had been. It was still there, to be sure, but it had been tamped down a bit. If the woman herself was not the same as her letter portrayed, there would always be some level of disappointment between reading what she wrote him and seeing her face to face. Still, he did so enjoy her letters, so he picked up the missive and opened it to read. "Lord Greene, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to thank you again for your invitation to tea yesterday. It was a lovely afternoon, and I'm so glad you and my stepsister were able to get on so well. Lady Marie very much enjoyed your conversation with her. I knew you two would like each other, and it makes my heart soar. We are both eager to see you again, and would like to invite you to join us for lunch tomorrow at our home, if it is convenient for you. We eagerly await your response, and look forward to your company once more. Yours sincerely, Lady Harriet." His heart began beating with excitement. but he was ashamed to admit that it was not at the prospect of seeing Lady Harriet again, but at seeing Lady Marie. I am the worst sort of man. I claim to fall for one sister, and yet find myself enchanted by the other. He should not accept the invitation. It could only lead to trouble. But the temptation to see Lady Marie was just too powerful to resist. Ultimately, he knew he would accept. He was helpless not to. "Rumour has it you've taken an interest in Lady Harriet Parson, Greene. A rather interesting match, to be sure." Alexander glanced up at his best friend, Mr. Frank Hanson, a businessman from America who was making a name for himself among London's import and export markets. They were enjoying their afternoon together at Alexander's favourite London tea room. Admittedly, Alexander was rather distracted by his conundrum with Lady Harriet and Lady Marie. Hearing Frank ask about it, though, was a shock. He did not like that word was spreading so quickly through society about the potential match. "Indeed," Alexander grunted. "She's a charming young lady. Any man would be lucky to call her his." Which was absolutely the truth. Lady Harriet was a wonderful woman. He just did not think she was necessarily wonderful for him. Lady Marie, however, she feels more right for me. Not that it mattered. He could not pursue her. "You seem down, Greene," Frank said with a frown. "Is everything quite right?" Alexander blinked and forced a smile. "Apologies. I am preoccupied today, that is all." "Indeed? What has you so distracted?" Alexander considered telling Frank the truth. It was eating him inside, and he felt the need to share his concerns with someone. Frank was trustworthy and would not tell another soul what Alexander told him in confidence. Leaning over the table, Alexander murmured, "In truth, Frank, I find myself in a bit of a mess. I did indeed have intentions of courting Lady Harriet, but now I'm not so sure." Frank furrowed his brow. "Why? Is the lady not to your liking?" Alexander looked around to ensure no one could hear them. "That is not it exactly. Lady Harriet is lovely, it is just I have encountered someone else, and I think we might be better suited." "Oh, who is that?" Alexander felt his cheeks flare with shame. "Lady Marie Parson, Lady Harriet's sister." Frank's eyes widened. "I see. That is quite the situation you find yourself in, my friend." Alexander nodded and sighed. "I've no idea how to proceed. I don't wish to insult Lady Harriet by abandoning her in favour of her sister, especially now that the whole of London has heard our names linked together." Frank appeared to consider that for a moment. "Could you go without seeing either? It'd be less of a blow to Lady Harriet if you broke things off without pursuing her sister." Alexander thought about the possibility of not seeing Lady Marie again, and his gut twisted. "If I keep seeing Lady Harriet, I will be able to continue seeing Lady Marie." "I don't know that I can do that," he admitted softly. Frank sighed. "Then I think it'd be best for you to proceed as you have been until you can find a suitable way to disentangle yourself from both ladies without causing them undue pain." Alexander believed Frank was right. If he was not yet willing to give up Lady Marie, he had no choice but to continue forward with her sister. "I only hope I'm able to come up with a way to fix this situation before Lady Harriet falls in love with me and I'm forced to break her heart." Chapter 13, Marie. "Where is Harriet?" Bertha's sharp voice sliced against Marie like a whip. She jolted, surprised by her stepmother's sudden appearance in her room. Whirling around, she faced Bertha, who stood with her hands on her hips and ice in her eyes. "I believe she went for a walk," Marie answered. That was, of course, untrue. Harriet had snuck away early that morning to see Gerard and had begged Marie to cover for her in case Bertha tried to find her. Marie was more than happy to do so, at least until she was face to face with an irate Bertha. "For a walk?" Her stepmother spat. Has she lost her senses? Lord Greene is due here within the hour, and she's gone for a walk? What if she's not back in time to greet him? Marie folded her hands in front of her and murmured, She requested that I do so in her place if she's absent." "What?" Bertha shouted. "What is that girl thinking? She's putting everything at risk." "I believe she's simply nervous and wanted to exercise out some of the excess energy," Marie quickly said. "She will no doubt make it back in time for lunch. She may just be late in arriving." She didn't think that soothed her stepmother's pique at all, but the woman at least took a deep breath to rein in her temper. "Very well," she grumbled. Her eyes swept over Marie from head to foot, and she scowled. "You'll make a poor substitute, but I suppose you'll have to do. Straighten your shoulders. I can't have you looking like a hunched-over old crone when Lord Greene arrives." "Yes, stepmother," Marie said, immediately throwing her shoulders back and raising her chin. Bertha still gazed at her with disdain, but Marie did not think she would ever look at her differently. "Dress quickly," the woman ordered. "If Lord Greene arrives before I'm ready, you will greet him and endeavour to make a good impression until I can join you. Do you understand?" Marie nodded her head. "Of course." Bertha glared at her for a long moment. "If the day goes poorly, I will hold you responsible." "Yes," Marie breathed. "I understand." With a swish of her skirts, Bertha turned and strode from the room. Marie did not breathe until the Dowager Countess was out of sight. Her heart was hammering in her chest both from fear and excitement. It was a risky game she and Harriet were playing. She just prayed it would all be worth it in the end, and they would both find their happiness. "The Marquess of Torwell, my lady." Marie stood at the butler's announcement and tried to keep her breathing steady as Lord Greene strode into the parlour where she awaited him. He stopped when his eyes found her, and his lips curled into a wide smile. "Lady Marie, it's a pleasure to see you again," he said in his deep voice. She dropped into a curtsy. "It's a pleasure to see you as well, my lord." He gazed around the room, no doubt noting that she was alone. "Where are your stepsister and mother?" She rose back to her full height to answer. "They will be along presently, my lord. In the meantime, would you like to take a seat?" "Yes, thank you." She led him to a chaise in front of the fireplace, then sat across from him. She was so nervous she was afraid she'd lose her wits and say something foolish, so she struggled to say anything at all. The silence between them stretched as she tried to think of a suitable subject for them to discuss. "Have you read any of the books in here, my lady?" Lord Greene suddenly asked, gazing around the room. There were several volumes displayed throughout. She nodded. "These and many more, my lord. We have an extensive library." "Indeed? Tell me, what are your favourites?" Excited by the topic, Marie regaled him with all her favourite books, and he shared some of his. She was surprised to find they had many in common, and their conversation became much more animated as they exchanged opinions and critiques of their shared favourites. "Have you by chance read the latest by Sir Walter Scott?" she asked him, her heart hammering as she could hardly contain her delight. His eyes instantly lit up. "Indeed, he is a particular favourite of mine." "Mine as well," she declared. She realised her tone was overly excited, and so she tried to sound calmer and more sophisticated when she continued. "Do you prefer his poetry or his novels?" Lord Greene thought for a moment before answering. "While his poetry is brilliant, I must say I find myself enchanted by his prose." She could not stop her grin. "I feel the same way." It was suddenly so easy to talk to him. She wondered how she had ever struggled in the first place. Suddenly he said, "I hope it wasn't presumptuous of me, but I brought my bow along and wondered if perhaps you'd like to shoot together for a bit." Her jaw dropped in delight. "Oh, yes, my lord. I'd like that very much." He appeared thrilled by her eagerness, and they sent servants to prepare her target in the garden. Once Lord Greene had fetched his bow from his carriage, they walked out together to find her bow and 2 quivers waiting for them. As they took turns shooting their target, they exchanged compliments and witty banter, and Marie couldn't remember a time when she had so much fun. She was so engaged with Lord Greene and having such a good time that she completely forgot that they would not be alone for long. When Harriet found them in the garden, Marie felt a crushing disappointment that their time together was over. She then felt instant guilt that she had felt such a thing toward Harriet. "Good day, Lord Greene," Harriet said as she came to stand next to them. "Good day, my lady," he replied. Marie thought he seemed disappointed as well, though it could just be her imagination. She hoped it was not, however. She hoped he had enjoyed their time alone as much as she had. "You two appear to be having a splendid time." Harriet stole a glance toward Marie and offered her a secret little smile. "Indeed we are," Lord Greene nodded, grinning. "Would you care to join us, Lady Harriet?" "Oh, no, I'm afraid I'm hopeless with a bow," she answered. Marie's eyes widened as she caught Harriet's slip. At the ball, she and Lord Greene had spoken extensively of archery. It would not make sense for her now to have no talent for it. She waited with bated breath for his response. When he appeared momentarily confused, she was certain their ruse was over. Then, to her surprise, his expression cleared of bafflement. "That is a shame," he said. "Would you like me to teach you?" Harriet shook her head. "Oh, don't let me interrupt your fun. I'll simply cheer you both on. I'm rather tired from my long walk this morning." For the remainder of her days, Marie knew she would never be able to repay Harriet for what she was doing for her. She and Lord Greene resumed their sport, while Harriet observed them with a bright smile on her face. All seemed well again, until Bertha appeared, looking cross as she observed the happenings in the garden. When she loudly cleared her throat, Marie went still, lowering her bow and bowing her head. "We should go inside for lunch, I think," she said softly. "Oh, well, yes, I suppose we should," Lord Greene replied, again seeming disappointed, which only made her feel more hopeful. The three returned to the house with Bertha, who quickly monopolised the conversation. She talked incessantly throughout their meal, and Marie got the sense that she was trying to steal any opportunity there might have been for her to speak to Lord Greene some more. When lunch was over, and it was time for Lord Greene to depart, Marie could not help but feel robbed of her time with him. She was furious with Bertha, but she maintained her composure and watched as Lord Greene said goodbye to Harriet. As he walked out the door, however, his eyes found hers and lingered. She smiled shyly and then dropped her gaze before Bertha caught her. She didn't think, however, that even her stepmother's anger could dampen her happiness in that moment. Chapter 14, Alexander. He could not get the image of Lady Marie's shy smile out of his head. She was thoroughly enchanting, and the way she looked at him when they were together was thrilling. His guilt over Lady Harriet grew, but he could not deny that Lady Marie had stolen his affections away from her stepsister. It was a proper mess Alexander found himself in. Lady Harriet continued to be wonderful, but he was getting the sense that she may not be too interested in him either. Perhaps he was simply hoping that was the case. It would be far easier to justify his infatuation with Lady Marie if he believed her stepsister possessed only lukewarm feelings for him. What am I to do? How do I make this right? A sudden knock on his bedroom door tore him from his thoughts. He moved across the room to answer it and found a footman on the other side with a letter from Lady Harriet. He opened it eagerly, though it was not in truth because he was desperate for word from Lady Harriet. Rather, he wanted to know if she sent word of her stepsister. "Dearest Lord Greene, thank you for a wonderful day. I was happy we could spend more time becoming better acquainted with each other. Lady Marie sends her regards as well, and her thanks. She wanted you to know that she has not had so much fun in quite some time, and she was sad that your time together could not continue. You are a remarkable gentleman with an engaging presence that one can find hard to resist. You're like the sun, warm and welcoming, and we are but flowers eager for your light. I apologize if my words are too intense, but I cannot help myself. You nearly inspire me to poetry. I count the days until we see each other again. Yours sincerely, Lady Harriet." He stared down at the letter in disbelief. These words seemed so at odds with how Lady Harriet acted around him when they were together. She was friendly and charming, but distant, more polite than passionate. Her letter, however, displayed a great deal of passion. He could not make sense of the difference. Which was the true Lady Harriet? With a sigh, he lowered the letter and pinched the bridge of his nose. When he had met her at the ball, he had not expected such complications in pursuing her. I must figure out the best way to navigate this, and soon. He needed to determine once and for all which was the truth, the Lady Harriet he knew in person or the Lady Harriet he knew through her letters. Tell me, how are things progressing with Lady Harriet? Alexander stiffened, caught off guard by his father's question. They were returning from a brisk ride through a nearby park, and Alexander had grown lost in thought. Unfortunately, his thoughts had been centred on Lady Marie. "Oh, well, things are fine," he said cautiously. His father frowned at him. "Fine? That is all?" Alexander shrugged. "Yes, fine." Reaching the stable, the Duke passed his reins off to a stable hand and turned to face Alexander fully. "Son, I don't mean to poke my nose into matters that aren't truly my business," he began, "but I must insist that if you continue to call upon this lady, you make your intentions clear. It isn't fair to her to continue in this way without entering into an official courtship." His father was right. Of course he was. Alexander knew what he was doing with Lady Harriet could not continue as it was for much longer. If he did not enter into an official courtship with her, she would not only be humiliated, but would have wasted significant time on him that could have been used to find another match. "I know, father," he murmured. "I will make a decision soon." His father nodded. "Good. That young lady deserves to know, one way or another." With that, the Duke clapped Alexander on his shoulder and returned to the house. Alexander was not ready to go inside himself. He was full of anxious energy and decided to practice his archery to burn it off. As he walked toward the garden to set up his target, a sudden thought struck him. He came to a halt and groaned. "I left my bow at Lady Harriet's home. He was such an idiot. He cringed at the idea of facing her before he knew how to resolve their situation. There was little choice in the matter, however, if he wanted his bow back. Rubbing his temples, he turned back for the stables to fetch a horse and make his way to Lady Harriet's home before he talked himself out of it. "Right this way, my lord. I will fetch your bow for you." "Thank you." Alexander nodded his head to the butler and then followed him to the parlour. He was tempted to ask if either of the Parson sisters were home, but he held his tongue. It would be one thing to ask about Lady Harriet, but entirely inappropriate to ask about Lady Marie, though that is who he truly wished to see. As he waited for the butler to return with his bow, he strolled around the parlour, studying the books that Lady Marie had said she so enjoyed. "Lord Greene, I didn't realise you were returning so soon." Shoulders tensing, Alexander spun around and felt his heart hammer in his chest when his eyes fell on Lady Marie standing in the doorway of the parlour. Her gaze was wide and surprised, and her cheeks were a delicate shade of pink. "Lady Marie, good day," he said, bowing. "I forgot my bow and returned to retrieve it." "Oh, I see," she nodded. She began wringing her hands together nervously as she moved into the room. "Would you like some tea?" I should tell her no. Get my bow and leave before I'm tempted by her further. Yet even as he thought about his rejection, his lips parted to say, "That would be lovely, thank you." She smiled softly and turned back to the door to call for refreshments. Then she invited him to sit, and she sat across from him. As they were taking their seats, the butler appeared with Alexander's bow. "Oh, excellent!" Lady Marie stood back up and moved across the room to take the bow from the butler and take it to Alexander herself. He quickly pushed to his feet as she neared. "Thank you," he said as she handed it to him. Their hands brushed, and their gazes met. They stood for several moments, staring into each other's eyes, both gripping the bow between them. It was Lady Marie who broke eye contact first. She took a hasty step back, dropping her hands from the bow. "I beg your pardon," she murmured. Before he could reply, a servant entered the room with tea. Taking a deep breath, Alexander returned to his seat. Lady Marie sat across from him as the servant silently poured them tea. At length, the silence became awkward, and Alexander was desperate to break it. "Have you read anything interesting of late?" he asked. To his delight, her expression lit up. "As a matter of fact, I have." Standing, she moved to one of the bookcases and retrieved one of the volumes. Returning to Alexander, she offered it to him, and he took it without hesitation. Sitting once more, she animatedly told him all about the book, including how much the main character reminded her of Alexander himself. "You may borrow it if you wish," she said with an eager smile. "That's very generous of you," he replied. "I promise to return it." A soft breath blew from her lips. As he gazed at her, he was overwhelmed with the urge to make her eyes light up again. Would Lady Harriet like to attend the theatre with me tomorrow night?" "Of course, I would love it if you joined us." A strange look crossed her face, but was quickly replaced with a grateful smile. "I would very much enjoy that, my lord," she replied. "However, you will have to ask my stepmother for permission." "Of course." As if they'd summoned them with their words, Lady Dunwich and Lady Harriet walked through the front door of the house. They both came to a startled stop when they caught sight of Alexander and Lady Marie together in the parlour. "Lord Greene," Lady Dunwich declared, hurrying to the door of the room. "We weren't expecting you, were we?" He shook his head quickly. "No, my lady. I forgot my bow and stopped by to collect it." "Oh, I see," she smiled, her gaze sweeping over to Lady Marie. "I'm so glad my stepdaughter was here to greet you." With a start, Alexander realised he hadn't addressed Lady Harriet yet. Bowing to her, he said, "My lady, I wondered if you might be interested in attending the theatre tomorrow night. With your mother's permission, of course." "Granted!" Lady Dunwich exclaimed before Lady Harriet could even reply. "I'd like Lady Marie to attend as well," he added quickly. Lady Dunwich appeared stunned, and then barked out a startled laugh the next. "Marie?" she blurted. Then she took a moment to compose herself before continuing in an oddly tight voice. "Well, my lord, that would be quite all right." Alexander glanced toward Lady Marie. Her cheeks were bright red, and he might have thought it from embarrassment, but her lips were fighting not to grin. His heart raced, seeing that she appeared pleased by his invitation. Now he only needed to find a way to dispel the guilt eating away at him whenever he gazed at her. As of yet, however, he had no idea how. Chapter 15. Marie. "You will not speak to the Marquess, do you understand?" Bertha snapped as she sorted through the gowns in her wardrobe. "His attention must be fully on Harriet." Marie nodded silently as she watched Bertha tear through her clothing. She'd said she was looking for something for Marie to wear. It was an unusually thoughtful gesture, and Marie was suspicious that there was a catch. "Ah, this will do," Bertha announced, pulling out a dress that Marie did not think could be called pretty. It was in no way as lovely as the gown Harriet would be wearing, but it was still finer than most of the dresses Marie herself possessed. Pretty or not, she would be grateful for the opportunity to wear something more fashionable, despite what Bertha's intentions were. Her stepmother handed her the dress and hissed, "Now go get ready. Harriet will not be late for her outing with Lord Greene because of you." "Yes, stepmother," Marie murmured, clutching the dress to her chest and hurrying from the room. She ran to Harriet's chambers and burst through the door. She came to a stumbling stop when she spotted her stepsister. "Oh, Harriet, you look beautiful." Harriet turned and smiled at her, a vision in emerald green silk. "Thank you, Marie," she replied. Her eyes fell on the dress Marie was holding, and her face fell. "Oh, is that what Mother picked out for you?" Marie nodded and shrugged. "It's all right. It's a lovely dress." Harriet scoffed. "No, it isn't. She's intentionally given you something that is unflattering." "Don't worry," Marie insisted with a small smile. "I'm just happy that she is allowing me to go with you." Harriet moved closer so she could take her hand. "Go on, get dressed," she said with a sigh. "Despite what my mother might be hoping for, we won't let her ruin the evening." Marie nodded, grinning. "No, we won't." She went into Harriet's dressing room to change with the help of Harriet's lady's maid. When she re-emerged, Harriet's smile was wide. "Oh, Marie, you're beautiful," she declared, clapping her hands together. "No matter what you wear, you're always so lovely." Marie felt her cheeks heat, and she dropped her gaze in delight and embarrassment. "Thank you, Harriet." Harriet walked to her side and hooked her arm through Marie's, whispering conspiratorially, "Now then, let's go and stun Lord Greene into utter silence with your beauty." He was watching her. Marie could feel his eyes on her through the whole of the performance. She tried not to let it show that she realized he was staring, but the corners of her lips twitched as she fought her grin. Harriet sat next to her, pretending not to notice, though she could not quite hide her smile either. "Are you enjoying the play, my lady?" Lord Greene whispered, leaning closer to her. Her breath caught in her throat, but she managed to nod. "Very much, my lord." "I'm happy you were able to join us," he confessed softly. She glanced toward him and allowed herself a small smile. "I am as well." They held each other's gazes for several long moments before he blinked and turned away, clearing his throat. Marie pulled her gaze back to the play, but it was difficult to pay attention to the activity on stage. She was too aware of him, and it was distracting her. Harriet suddenly leaned in on her other side and whispered, "I believe he is halfway in love with you." Marie stared at her sister with wide eyes, afraid of the hope she felt blossoming in her heart. She shook her head slightly, denying it, but Harriet merely arched a brow and nodded. Peeking over at Lord Greene, Marie felt uncertainty bubble in her belly, mixing with hope. If he discovers our deception, he may very well hate me. From that night onward, Marie continued to write letters to Lord Greene using Harriet's name. She found she simply could not help herself. If he was halfway in love with her, she was already completely in love with him. For each letter she wrote, she would receive a prompt and engaging response. He was a talented writer, and his letters were filled with wit and beautiful prose. "Lady Harriet, I find myself thinking of you often as well. It is the strangest thing being so concerned about the well-being of another. Someone beyond the confines of familial obligation. I am constantly hoping that you and Lady Marie are well." "Lady Harriet, our walk through the park the other day was invigorating. I did not realize you had such an eye for plants and foliage. What a fascinating intellect you possess. Your stepsister, too. Though different, I find you both very engaging." In every letter, he mentioned Marie by name, and it made her heart soar at the same time as it took away some of the sting, knowing he was not really writing to her. It was becoming more and more difficult for her to maintain her charade. She was falling in love with him and did not wish to lie any more. Her greatest fear was that she told him the truth, and his letters stopped arriving. Chapter 16. Alexander. He was impossibly more confused than ever. Lady Harriet's letters continued to arrive, and each one was more fascinating than the last. He could not help but still feel drawn to her through her writing. Yet, when they interacted, it was Lady Marie who thrilled and enchanted him. Her charm, wit, and sweetness were intoxicating, and he found he could not resist her. He fell for her a little more with each encounter. Alexander was at a loss for what to do. He wished the Lady Harriet he met in her letters was the same woman he met in person, but she simply was not. It baffled him how someone could seem like two completely different people in separate settings. As he sat in his library, he considered his options for perhaps the 100th time in the course of a few hours. He could break things off with Lady Harriet and turn his attention entirely to Lady Marie, but that would no doubt hurt and insult the former. He could walk away from both women completely. It would be a clean break for them all, and he would not risk hurting Lady Harriet nearly so much. Yet he would likely never see Lady Marie again, and the very thought made him nauseous. His last option was to continue pursuing Lady Harriet and enter into a formal courtship with her. The irony of the situation was that he would likely have happily done so already had he not met Lady Marie. As much as the thought of losing her hurt him, the idea of seeing her all the time, having her be a permanent fixture in his life, but never being able to be with her, was possibly more painful. He ran his hand along the spine of the book sitting in his lap. Her book, the one she had lent him. He had been reading it most of the day, and he found he had trouble putting it down. She had exquisite taste in books, and he was eager to know what her next recommendation would be. Letting his head fall back against his chair, he released a heavy sigh. He wanted her. Oh, how he wanted her. He had never felt this way about any other woman before in his life. Why couldn't it have been her I met at the ball? That question haunted him. He could not let himself dwell on it, however. It would do him little good to obsess over the things he couldn't change. Opening the book, he tried to pick back up at the spot he had left off at, but he could not concentrate on the words on the page. All he could think of was her. In truth, she was almost all he thought about of late. I must see her again, by any means necessary. He needed some excuse, though he doubted he could come up with one that would allow him to see her without Lady Harriet present. Still, he had the odd sense that Lady Harriet did not mind when his attention was directed to her stepsister. At times it almost seemed as though she encouraged it. He shook his head, dislodging the ridiculous idea. Lady Harriet continued to write to him because she continued to believe there was a future between them. She would not push him onto her sister if she were pouring so much of herself into her letters to him. That issue at least settled in his mind. He returned his thoughts to Lady Marie, ignoring the guilt that immediately rushed through him. There had to be a way to see her again. Since there was likely no future for them together, he needed to take every opportunity he could find to enjoy her company in the present. If such opportunities would not happen naturally, he would find ways to create them himself. Chapter 17. Marie. The knock on her door was sharp and instantly recognizable. Marie considered ignoring it and pretending she was not there, but she knew that would be pointless. Bertha would not have come to her rooms if she was not certain Marie was inside. Dragging her feet across the room, she opened the door and forced a smile. "Good afternoon," she said in as sweet a voice as she could muster. "To what do I owe this visit?" Bertha pushed past Marie to step into the room. Marie clenched her fists as irritation shot through her, but she released a deep breath and calmly shut the door instead of berating the Dowager Countess for intruding into her personal space. "You and I must talk, Marie," Bertha stated without preamble or warmth. "What about?" Marie asked, clasping her hands in front of her and bowing her head slightly. Placing her hands on her hips, her stepmother regarded her coldly. "It has become clear that the Marquess has taken a liking to you, though I can't imagine why," she said. "You are hurting Harriet's chances with him, and I won't allow that. You will not be permitted to join them in their outings from now on." Panic seized Marie's heart, and she raised her gaze to stare at the Dowager Countess in disbelief. "What? No, you are mistaken." Bertha shook her head sharply. "He doesn't look at her the way he looks at you, and that is unacceptable. You will not sabotage this for her. I won't let you." I'm trying to—" Bertha rolled her eyes and turned away from Marie, but then paused, her gaze sliding down to the floor next to the bed. When Marie realized what it was her stepmother was looking at, her heart stopped. "What is that?" she demanded to know, pointing to a small polished box half hidden under Marie's bed. That is nothing," Marie insisted, but before she could say more or come up with any type of excuse, Bertha had bent down and picked up the box. No, please don't." It was too late, however. The Dowager Countess flipped the lid of the box open and slipped her hand inside to pull out what Marie had hidden there. Alexander's letters. She felt the blood drain from her face as Bertha began to unfold and read them. Marie watched helplessly as her stepmother's gaze widened in disbelief, and she quickly moved on to the next letter. Then the next, and the next. Bertha's expression shifted from shocked to enraged as she made her way through the pile of correspondence. When she had read all the letters, she slowly turned to Marie. "You deceitful little snake," she snarled. Raising the box over her head, she threw it down and smashed it against the floor. Marie jumped back with a yelp. Bertha advanced on her and grabbed her arm, her fingers squeezing Marie's flesh so tightly it felt as though she were rubbing bone. Marie flinched and cried out, twisting to try and get away from the Dowager Countess. With a vicious shriek, Bertha threw her to the ground. "You will pay for this," she swore, pointing a finger at Marie. "I will make you suffer for this treachery. I knew you were not to be trusted, and now I have my definitive proof." Picking up her skirts, she spun around and marched for the door. Marie did not try to follow her and instead remained huddled on the floor, holding her throbbing arm. Bertha paused at the threshold of the door and glared back at Marie. "I am locking this door," she growled. "The next time you're permitted to leave it will be for your wedding to Lord Felton. Until then, you will go nowhere and see no one." "No, please!" Marie cried, but it was too late. Bertha slammed the door shut behind her, and Marie heard the distinct sound of the bolt sliding into place. Pushing to her feet, she ran forward and began pounding her fists against the door. "Help me!" she screamed. "Let me out! Bertha! Harriet! Anyone!" Yet she knew it was useless. The tears began falling just before her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor. It was over. She knew it, deep in her heart. Bertha would make sure she never saw Alexander again. She will tell him, and he will hate me. She will poison him against me. He would never know the truth of the matter, and it broke her heart to think of the misery he would suffer at the thought of such a betrayal. She clutched her head in her hands and sobbed. She would lose Alexander and be forced to marry a greedy old man who was more concerned with money and power than anything of real substance. Marie would never be able to love him, and knew he would not care about loving her. She was going to be trapped with a man who viewed her a little more than an ornament. He would never see her for who she truly was. She would not only lose Alexander, the only man she had ever loved, but she would also lose her very self. Chapter 18. Alexander. He paced the parlour frantically, his anxiety high as he wondered what could be so urgent that Lady Dunwich had summoned him to her home immediately. She had said in her note that there was a grave matter they needed to discuss, and he worried that something had happened to Lady Marie or Lady Harriet. If Lady Marie is hurt or ill, I don't know that I'll be able to control my reaction. When Lady Dunwich finally swept into the room, it was all he could do not to take her by the shoulders and shake the news out of her. She came to a stop in front of him and gazed up at him with a distressed expression. "My lady, what has happened?" he demanded to know. "Why have you summoned me here with such urgency?" She clutched her hands to her heart and looked nearly on the verge of tears. "Oh, my dear Lord Greene, I have discovered the most terrible treachery. I'm so ashamed." He furrowed his brow, anxiety settling into his chest. "What treachery, my lady?" She squeezed her eyes shut, as if the words she needed to speak were too painful to voice out loud. "I've discovered that my stepdaughter, Lady Marie, has been deceiving you," she said in a broken voice. "How so?" he cautiously asked, that anxious weight growing heavier and heavier. Lady Dunwich's eyes snapped open, and she held his gaze as she said, "She has been posing as my daughter, Lady Harriet, and writing to you." "What?" He was sure he had misheard her. That could not be right. Lady Marie was not capable of such falsehood. "There must be some mistake." Lady Dunwich sniffled and shook her head. "I'm afraid there is no mistake, my lord. I discovered your letters to Lady Harriet in Lady Marie's room. She confessed to trying to fool you." Even as she spoke the words, he could not believe they were true. Lady Marie is an honest woman, kind, sweet and clever. She would never do such a thing. Yet when he considered the incredible difference between the letters he had been receiving and the way Lady Harriet appeared face to face, he was filled with doubt. It would make sense that someone else was writing her letters. And they did seem to match Lady Marie's personality far better than Lady Harriet's. His stomach twisted with growing rage and devastating disappointment. "I can assure you that Lady Harriet had no knowledge of this," Lady Dunwich added. "Lady Marie worked alone and behind my daughter's back." He did not believe that. The two young women were nearly inseparable, and Alexander could not imagine Lady Marie would do something that would hurt Lady Harriet. No, they had to be in on the scheme together. Which would explain why Lady Harriet never seemed upset when I spent more time with Lady Marie. They had been playing him for a fool. It had all been nothing but a game to them. They were two bored rich girls who had found their entertainment in breaking his heart. "Thank you for your honesty, Lady Dunwich," he murmured, moving for the door. "If you'll excuse me." "Oh, my lord, don't go just yet. Lady Harriet will be along shortly." But Alexander was already crossing the foyer towards the main door. He needed to get out of that house and away from those women before he lost all reason and did something he knew he would regret. The entire carriage ride home, he could not stop thinking about Lady Marie and how she had turned out to be a far different person than who he had thought her to be. She was an excellent actress, if nothing else. He had bought her deceit without hesitation or thought. And now she's broken me. I will never be the same because of her. This was why he had not wanted anything to do with women and marriage in the first place. They made things unnecessarily complicated and put one at risk of heartache and humiliation. When he arrived home, he immediately called for his horse to be saddled and his target to be prepared. He would forget them both, he determined. Vigorous exercise was just what he needed to rid himself of the lies the two spoiled rich girls had told him. He rode at a breakneck speed, careless of the danger he put himself in. When he returned to the main grounds, he practiced his archery until his fingers bled. No matter what pain he inflicted on himself or how exhausted he became, he could not dull the throbbing pain in his chest where his shattered heart lay in ruins. She did not think she had any tears left. She had cried so much over the last several days. Her heart was broken and she was sure it was beyond repair. I deserve this, though. I deserve this pain for lying to him. True to her word, Bertha kept her locked away in her room. The only person she saw was her lady's maid, who brought her food and helped her change and bathe. She could not stand the woman's looks of pity, however, and thought she would rather starve than have to endure them. The days dragged by, and Marie could find no solace for her agony. She would try to read her beloved novels, but they only made the ache in her chest worse. Every chapter she would stop and cry, knowing she would never experience the love she found portrayed within the pages. She'd lost it, and she feared she would never have the chance to get it back. At night she dreamed of Alexander and all that they could have been had she only been honest with him from the start. It was hard not to hate herself for what she had done, but it was also hard not be disappointed that he never asked her why she had done what she did. The days blended into weeks, and she lost all track of time. No one in her family came to see her, not even Harriet, although she had to believe that was because Bertha had made it impossible for her to do so. It was quite the shock one day, deep into her confinement, when the door to her room opened, and Bertha strode inside. Marie had been sitting and staring aimlessly out her window, but she pushed to her feet the moment her stepmother appeared. Bertha eyed her up and down. "You look awful." "That's what happens when you're confined to your room for days, even weeks. I don't even know anymore." Marie kept her thoughts to herself, however, and stared at Bertha in a silence she hoped her stepmother found unnerving. She believed she was successful because Bertha pursed her lips and waved her hand in the air between them. "Enough of this," she snapped. "I need your help, Mary. Something has happened." Mary's shoulders instantly tensed. "What is it?" she asked, breaking her silence with a hard tone. "Harriet has run away," Bertha informed her in a tight voice. Marie gasped. "What?" Her stepmother clenched her jaw. "You will help me find her because it is your fault this has happened. You created this mess, and now you will do everything you can to clean it up again." Marie's mind was racing, and her heart was thundering so loudly that blood rushed through her ears. Her first thought was that Harriet had run away with Gerard. It made some sense, though Harriet was not the type to make such a bold move. Or so Marie had thought. But what if she hasn't gone to Gerard? What if she didn't go willingly wherever she is? As much as she hated Bertha, she loved Harriet more. The Dowager Countess, however, appeared to have read Marie's silence as hesitation rather than thoughtfulness. Before Marie could even utter a word, Bertha hissed, "Help me find my daughter, and I won't make you marry Lord Felton." Now that gave Marie pause. Bertha must believe Harriet truly in trouble if she was so willing to free her of her impending marriage. She regarded her stepmother carefully and was surprised to see that behind her icy glare there was true fear. With a heavy sigh, she nodded. "Very well, I'll help you," she said. "But I'm doing so for Harriet's sake, not yours." "I don't care for whose sake you do it," Bertha snapped, "so long as you help me." Marie just hoped her help did not cause more harm than good to Harriet. She secretly prayed she was not in some kind of trouble and was safe somewhere with Gerard. "I hope I don't end up ruining her chances for love as my own have been ruined."
Thank you for watching. Before we continue into the story, make us a favor. Hit the subscribe button. This way we will be able to create more audiobooks for free for you. Thank you again. Now, back to our story.
Chapter 20. Alexander. The world seemed so muted somehow. It felt as if the brightness of the colours around him had been drained away, and all that was left behind was dull and lacklustre. Alexander felt hollow inside. In truth, he had felt very little as of late, save for irritability and the occasional bout of anger. His ability to feel anything seemed to have been drained from him just as the vividness of the world had been. Everything was dull and uninteresting. He stared down at the book Lady Marie had given him, which he had never returned, and felt a bitterness rise in him as he thought of her deception. He'd realised her lie had gone back to the beginning. It had been Lady Marie that he had met at that ball, not Lady Harriet. In the end, she had been exactly as he had first found her, masked. Nothing they had experienced together had been real, and that is what hurt him most of all. He had thought there was a genuine connection between them. Instead, it had all been deception, and he had been so in love he was blind to it all. Perhaps I deserve this for being so naive. I was too willing to love someone without even knowing who they truly were. What was worse was that it appeared he had not learned his lesson. Not entirely, because despite everything, he found he still missed Lady Marie. If he were not vigilant, his mind would wander toward her. He would recall her laugh, or the way her eyes sparkled when she smiled, and he would be filled with such a longing he thought he might die from it. With a shout, he pushed the book away and stormed from his room. He needed air, that was it. Fresh air and vigorous exercise to distract and exhaust him. He hurried down the hallway toward the second-story landing. As he passed by his father's study, however, the Duke's voice rang out from within. "Alexander, a word." Stopping, Alexander tilted his head back and took several deep breaths to try and calm his spiking irritation. It was not his father's fault that he had been deceived, and so he did not deserve to be on the receiving end of Alexander's temper. Slowly he walked into the study. The Duke sat behind his desk, a frown of concern marring his brow. "Please sit, son," he invited, indicating a chair opposite himself. "What is this about, Father?" Alexander asked, trying to sound as pleasant as possible. He did not think he succeeded entirely, however, if his father's flinch was any indication. Folding his hands before him, his father said, "Son, your mother and I are concerned about you. You are not yourself." Alexander wanted to groan in annoyance. "All is well, trust me." "All is not well," his father insisted. "It has been some time since you called upon Lady Harriet. Is she no longer receptive to your advances?" "Quite the opposite, I'm afraid. I'm no longer interested in her lies." He had not told his parents about Lady Harriet and Lady Marie. He was not exactly sure why. They deserved the Duke and Duchess's scorn. Yet the idea of his family hating the women, especially Lady Marie, was strangely unbearable for him. "It is nothing to concern yourself with, Father," Alexander answered at last. His father did not appear to like that answer. His frown deepened. "If you have done something to upset the lady, you must make amends immediately." "I have done nothing," Alexander snapped, shoving from his chair. "I will not sit here and be accused of things I didn't do. If Lady Harriet and I are no longer speaking, that is our business, not yours." The Duke appeared surprised by the outburst, and Alexander supposed he could not blame him. He never raised his voice to his father, for whom he had the utmost respect. His shortness of temper was a testament to how truly broken Lady Harriet and Lady Marie had left him. Particularly Lady Marie, who had my heart in her hand and crushed it between her fingers. "I'm sorry, son," the Duke said at length, gathering his wits again. "I did not realize your mood. It is perhaps best that we talk later, once you've calmed down." Scrubbing his chin, Alexander nodded. "Thank you, Father," he murmured before leaving the room without a backward glance. "Why did I allow you to drag me here?" Alexander grumbled before taking a long drink of his champagne. Frank glanced toward him with a smirk and a shrug. "You were in desperate need of liberation from your misery," the man replied. It was a pathetic thing to behold. Alexander rolled his eyes. "Still, we could have gone to White's or some such place. Why force me to attend a dinner party? Do you wish to parade my despair in front of the ton?" They would devour him alive if they got wind of such vulnerability. "There are no women at the clubs," Frank explained, his eyes bouncing around the room. "If you wish to move past Lady Marie, you must let another pretty young lady of charm and pedigree catch your eye." Alexander did not think that was possible. Finding another lady was the very last thing he wished to do. "There are many pretty ones present," Frank said. "You need only look around to see for yourself." Alexander did allow his eyes to roam, but unlike Frank, he was able to see past the glamour and wealth draping everyone around them. They were all wearing masks, he realized, hiding who they truly were to play the games the ton demanded of them. It was sickening. He was tired of it all, of London and of society, of dishonest faces and deceit. "I want to leave," he said out loud, catching Frank off guard. His friend blinked up at him in clear disappointment. "Are you certain? We only just arrived." Alexander shook his head. "No, not the party. Though he would not mind leaving that as well. I want to get away from London. Go somewhere new where my name is not known and where I can start fresh." "Well, what about America?" Frank suggested. Arching a brow, Alexander regarded his friend closely. "America? You think that could be an escape for me?" Frank nodded. "It's been an escape for thousands before you. You could start over there, away from the heartbreak and memories." It was an intriguing idea. Alexander had always wanted to visit the New World and see what wonders lay on the other side of the ocean. Now seemed as good a time as any for a trip or an extended stay. If Frank was any indication, he was certain the people there would be real and authentic. He would not have to worry about falling into another trap of lies. "America? Is this some kind of joke?" Alexander had known his father would not approve of the idea, so he was prepared for the outrage. He did not think he could ever prepare himself enough for his mother's tears. Still, he tilted his chin up and met the Duke's eyes. "It is no joke. I'm quite serious," he replied. "Why?" his mother sobbed, looking up from her handkerchief. He had called them both into his father's study to give them the news. Thankfully, the Duchess had already been sitting, otherwise she surely would have collapsed to the floor. "I need to leave. Start fresh." He had not yet told them of Lady Marie and Lady Harriet's deception. For some reason he could not fathom, he did not want them to think so poorly of either woman, though he knew he would have to give them an explanation as to why he no longer wished to court Lady Harriet. "You cannot go," his mother insisted. "Your family is here. Your friends are here. Your land and title." "The land and title mean nothing to me now," he stated simply. He would undoubtedly miss his family and friends, but they would write to each other, and there could always be visits every other year or so. It would not be the same, but it would be better than living in perpetual agony. "I don't understand what could have happened to make you choose to do something so rash," his father said, shaking his head in bafflement. "I never thought a broken heart would be quite so unbearable that I would willingly run from my home to escape the pain." Instead of confessing such thoughts, however, he replied, "It's simply something I must do. I must escape this wretched place and the woman who has ruined me." Chapter 21. Marie. "We've found her, my lady." Marie felt her stomach flip at the footman's words to Bertha. Her stepmother released a relieved sigh and nodded. "Where?" she snapped. "An old abandoned keep just up the road. She was with a gentleman." Bertha's face went stark white. "Tell the others that if I hear word of this so much as breathed elsewhere, there will be dire consequences," she hissed. "Bring my daughter to me." The footman gulped and nodded. "Yes, my lady." He turned and hurried out the door. Marie and the Dowager Countess sat together in a little room in a roadside inn. The moment Marie had confessed that Harriet was likely with Gerard, Bertha had ordered her carriage, and they took off with several servants to hunt down the merchant's family. It had taken a little time, and several threats, but Gerard's parents had finally confessed that their son and Harriet had run off together with the intention of eloping. They had pointed Bertha and Marie in the direction they had gone. Upon finding the inn, Bertha had ordered the servants to search ahead while she and Marie waited behind in stony silence. Marie was overwhelmed with guilt. She had all but traded her stepsister's happiness for her own freedom, and she could not be more ashamed of herself. Harriet would likely hate her for this, and she did not blame her. "I cannot marry Lord Felton, however. Harriet and I will figure out some way for her and Gerard to be together, but I cannot be forced into a union with that disgusting man. It was selfish, and she knew it, but she could not help herself." Bertha did not speak to her as they waited for Harriet. Marie could only imagine what she was thinking. She could sense the frustrations simmering beneath her stepmother's icy surface. At last, the door opened, and Harriet was escorted inside. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and the sight of her misery made Marie's heart twist. "I've done this to her. This is my fault." Bertha stood and walked to within reach of her daughter. Raising her hand, she slapped Harriet across the cheek. Marie flinched and stifled a soft gasp. "What were you thinking?" Bertha snarled as Harriet stared up at her. "Are you truly so eager to throw your life away for that worthless man?" "He is not worthless," Harriet protested. "He is—" "Silence!" the Dowager Countess shouted. Harriet fell quiet, and Marie did not dare say a word. "Do you know what would happen if word of your indiscretion got out? Your reputation would be in shreds. You would be ruined, and no decent gentleman would want anything to do with you." "Gerard would," Harriet murmured. "He loves me, and I him." Bertha tilted her head and glared at her daughter. "Is that so? What was your plan exactly? Run away to Scotland to elope? Is that what you discussed over your picnic together?" Harriet gulped and shook her head. "Not Scotland. France. Gerard has family there." "Ah, France. How romantic," Bertha spat. You are a foolish, short-sighted child, and I am disgusted by this thoughtless act. You will return home with us at once, and should you try to resist, I promise it will not be you but your precious Gerard that suffers the consequences of your disobedience." Harriet gasped. "Mother, leave him alone." "You are not in a position to tell me what to do. Now get downstairs and into the carriage before someone sees you." For a moment Harriet looked as though she would protest, but in the end merely pressed her lips together to hold back her words, spun on her heel and marched back out the door. Marie slowly rose to her feet, almost too afraid to follow, but knowing she needed to face her stepsister sooner rather than later. "When we return home, you will prepare yourself for dinner," Bertha ordered with her back to Marie. "Lord Felton will arrive at the house by 7 o'clock. Marie froze and felt the blood rushing from her face. "Lord Felton? But I thought—" Bertha glanced back over her shoulder at her. "In the end, your betrayal of Harriet meant nothing. Your marriage to Lord Felton will still take place and my daughter will wed Lord Greene as planned. You had best make peace with that." With that, she walked out of the room, leaving Marie reeling and heartsick. Lord Felton was an ill-mannered brute. Marie stared at him in disgust from where she sat across from him at the table. From the moment he had walked through the door, she had known she would hate him. The way he looked at her sent shivers of revulsion running down her back. He stared at her as though she were a possession that he could not wait to get his greedy hands on. He talked to her as though she were a simpleton, and it irritated her to the point that she had little appetite. "I believe we will be satisfied with each other," he said around a mouthful of chicken. "I will provide you pretty dresses and other luxuries you women enjoy, and you will bear me a son. Our life will be most agreeable." The very idea of being pregnant with that man's child made Marie want to vomit. Bertha chuckled softly and offered Lord Felton a wide smile. "Lady Marie will be thrilled with such a life," she said. "What young lady could wish for more?" What young lady would wish for him? "Women are simple creatures after all," Lord Felton replied. "Give them something shiny to stare at, and they believe themselves in love." He threw his head back and laughed at his own poor joke. Marie merely glared at him, then turned to find Bertha smirking at her. She wished Harriet was with her, but her stepsister had been confined to her rooms. She wished Lord Greene were there instead of Lord Felton, but he likely hated her now and would never speak to her again. "I am trapped, doomed to misery for the rest of my life." It was enough to make one consider ending it all, but she did not allow her thoughts to venture down such a dark road. Yet, as she endured the rest of the meal with Lord Felton spitting and laughing across from her, she wondered if the life she was being forced into was one worth living for. Chapter 22. Alexander. "My lord, you have a visitor." Alexander did not bother turning to face the butler. He was busy packing. "Tell them I am on my way out. I do not have the time to see anyone at present." The butler did not leave, however. "My lord, it's Lady Harriet." Alexander froze and slowly turned around to face the butler. "Lady Harriet, what on earth is she doing here?" The man appeared at a loss for what to say and simply shrugged. "She wishes to speak with you, my lord. She claims it is an urgent matter." Alexander's instinct was to dismiss her immediately. However, his curiosity was overwhelming. He could not imagine how she could dare show her face to him, but a part of him was almost desperate to find out. "Very well," he grumbled. "Show her to the parlour. I'll be down presently." The butler bowed and left Alexander's room. He waited for several long minutes, his heart hammering as a nervous sweat broke out along his brow, and then he made his way to the parlour. Lady Harriet sat near the fireplace, and the moment he walked in, she pushed to her feet and faced him. "My lord, we must speak." He scowled at her. "I've nothing to say to you. You and your stepsister have made a fool of me, and I'll not allow you to do so again." "My lord, please." He shook his head firmly. "No. I'm leaving for the docks of Plymouth to sail to America today. I only agreed to meet you because I'm still a gentleman, despite you being far from a lady." Her eyes went wide, but not at his insult, which surprised him. "You mustn't go," she declared. "Please, my lord, you and my sister are meant to be together." That caught him off guard. The vehemence in her tone sounded genuine, and her eyes were wide and pleading. "I don't understand," he snapped. "It was all a trick." She shook her head. "No, it wasn't. It may have been a mistake, but it was no trick. Whatever my mother told you, she lied. My mother is a vile woman and has always hated Marie. She would do anything to steal my stepsister's happiness from her." Alexander still struggled to understand what she was telling him. "I have proof," she said, as if she could read his mind. Digging into her skirts, she produced a folded piece of paper and held it out to him. "I was searching my mother's rooms, trying to find your letters she had taken from Marie when I stumbled upon this." With hesitant fingers, Alexander took the paper from her and opened it. To his shock, he realised it was a copy of the late Lord Dunwich's will. In it, the Earl named Lady Marie as his beneficiary. He gaped up at Lady Harriet. "Is this true?" She nodded. "Yes. My mother has been lying to Marie and myself all this time. She's taken what should rightfully be my sister's for herself, and has done everything in her power to break Marie so she never threatens her. Now she's planning to marry her off to an old widower, trapping Marie in a horrible, loveless marriage forever." "What?" he gasped, horrified. His mind instantly rebelled against the idea of her married to another, and his heart demanded he go and save her at once. Lady Harriet nodded. "The wedding is today. It's a very rushed affair, as my mother wants to rid herself of Marie as quickly as possible." Alexander swallowed. "I don't know." She grabbed his hands and squeezed them. "I'm sorry for what happened. I'm sorry if you felt deceived, but you fell in love with my sister, not me. It was always Marie. She never meant any harm. She just wanted to go to a ball." He believed her. Despite everything, his gut told him to believe her. She was right, after all. He did love Lady Marie. He wanted to be with her, to marry her and raise a family with her. In that moment, Alexander recognised that Lady Harriet had likely saved him from the biggest mistake of his life. Gritting his teeth, he nodded his head. "Take me to her." Chapter 23. Marie. "I will not cry. I will not cry." She refused to give Bertha the satisfaction. Marie stood in the garden of her home, where she had often come throughout the years to try and escape her stepmother's scorn. Yet she could not escape this. She was well and truly trapped. In all her imaginings, she had never thought her wedding day would be so dreadful. Lord Felton stood next to her, and she shuddered when his hand brushed her shoulder. "You are a vision," he murmured, his voice reminding her of a snake. She didn't respond and kept her eyes locked on the minister in front of them. There were only a few other people present apart from Bertha, and they were all members of Lord Felton's family. There was no one there for Marie, not even Harriet. She thought perhaps Bertha had forbidden Harriet from attending, but she would not blame her stepsister if she had chosen not to come of her own free will. Suddenly the minister begins speaking, startling Marie from her saddened thoughts. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." No, 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 I don't want this. Yet she had no idea how to stop it. Marie helplessly stood in silence as the minister droned on. She did not know what she should do. She was powerless, just as her stepmother had always wanted her to be. "Now you recite your vows before each other and God," the minister declared. He turned his gaze to Marie. "Lady Marie, repeat after me. I, Lady Marie Parson." "I..." Marie felt as though the words lodged themselves in her throat and she could not get them out. She stared at the minister with wide eyes and mouth gaping as a tense silence fell among those gathered. "My lady, are you quite well?" the minister asked. Marie gazed up at him and felt Lord Felton stiffen beside her. "Say the words," he hissed. Stop!" Marie let out a gasp and whirled around. A relieved sob broke from her chest when her eyes fell on Harriet, who was running toward her. What was even more shocking than her stepsister's appearance was the fact that Alexander followed after her. Tears sprung into Marie's eyes as Harriet reached her and threw her arms around her. She could not even look toward Alexander as her stepsister dominated her attention. "All is well now," her stepsister assured her. "I'm here." Marie could not stop weeping. "What is the meaning of this, Harriet?" Bertha snapped, stepping closer to her daughter. Harriet turned to glare at her. "How could you, Mother?" "What do you mean?" Bertha sputtered. "How could I? What? Preserve a future where your ungrateful stepsister is cared for?" "No," Harriet snapped. "I mean this." She held up a piece of paper, and Bertha's eyes widened with shock. Her mouth opened, as though she was trying to say something, but no words came forth. "What is that?" Marie asked softly, her stomach twisting with anxiety. Harriet turned to face Marie, and there was regret in her gaze. "Here, read it," she said, handing the paper to Marie. Her eyes skimmed over the page, and Marie was shocked to realize it was a copy of her father's will. She had never seen it before and had only been told by Bertha what it contained. She quickly saw that her stepmother had lied to her. She turned to glare at Bertha. "It was all mine," she growled. "This entire time, the estate, everything had been left to me." "She knew," Alexander said, stepping up to Marie's side. Looking up at him, she was overwhelmed by her conflicting emotions. Elation at his presence, rage at her stepmother, sorrow at the reminder of her father. She wanted to cry and scream and throw her arms around him all at once. Instead, she reached for him and took his hand in hers, his touch at once steadying her. "Who do you think you are?" Lord Felton suddenly snarled, grabbing Alexander's arm and jerking him around. "Remove your hands from my bride." Alexander's face darkened with anger. "She is not your bride, not anymore. She is and has always been mine." "Lord Greene, wait," Bertha pleaded, but Alexander turned his terrifying glare on her. "You've done enough, woman," he hissed through gritted teeth. "I should have you arrested." Bertha's jaw dropped. "No, my lord, you don't understand. I did it all for the sake of my daughter." "Do not use me as your excuse, mother," Harriet snapped. "I am nothing like you and refuse to share your fate. Marie is free of you forever." "Free? I'm free?" She stared down at the paper in her hand, granting her wealth and agency over her own life. She was free. Turning back to Alexander, she asked, "If I am truly free, may I kiss you?" He appeared momentarily surprised by her bold question, but then smiled and nodded. "Yes, you may." Grinning, Marie reached her hands up to cup Alexander's face, and then pulled him down to her so she could press her lips to his. She felt such a burst of happiness. She thought she might cry tears of joy. She barely noticed Bertha's miserable howl of defeat as she and Alexander broke apart to gaze at each other. "There is something I must ask you before someone comes along to try and steal you away again," Alexander said. Marie let out a gasp as he sank to one knee and took her hand in his. "Lady Marie Parson, I am madly in love with you. You are the only woman I have ever wanted for my own, and I don't think I can go on another moment without knowing for certain that you are mine. Will you make me the happiest of men and be my wife?" Fresh tears sprang to Marie's eyes as she nodded without hesitation. "Yes, of course I will." Alexander looked relieved, and then pushed to his feet with a laugh. Wrapping his arms around her, he picked her up and swung her around. "How dare you?" Lord Felton blustered. "She cannot accept your proposal, as she has already accepted mine." Marie ignored him, as did Alexander. They let him whine and complain as they rejoiced in the mutual happiness they had found together. When Alexander set her to her feet once more, he kissed her forehead and murmured in her hair, "I will never chance losing you again." "Nor I you," she replied, resting her face against his chest as she gripped his shirt with both hands. For as long as she lived, she would never let him go. He was hers, and she was his, and nothing would tear them apart. Chapter 24, Marie. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Releasing a deep breath, Marie turned a reassuring look on her husband and nodded. "I am." He offered her a half-smile and squeezed her hand encouragingly. Turning their attention back to the large doors of the parlour, they strode into the room side by side. Bertha was already there, waiting for them. The glare she gave them lacked some of its usual heat. Marie's stepmother appeared tired and half-hearted in her scorn as they approached her. "Ah, it's the newlyweds. Come to rid yourselves of me at last, I suppose." While her tone was scathing, Marie did not miss the anxiety underlying it. She and Alexander came to a stop. Tilting her chin, "Actually, it is quite the opposite." Bertha frowned, clearly caught off guard. "I don't understand what that means." Marie glanced up at Alexander, who gave her a small nod. "I am not forcing you to leave the estate," she said, looking back to her stepmother. The woman blinked, stunned. "What?" "You are allowed to stay so long as you accept our terms." Marie waited for Bertha to respond, subtly squeezing Alexander's hand as her nerves ate at her. "What terms?" the Dowager Countess slowly asked. Her gaze narrowed in suspicion. Marie threw back her shoulders. She had been preparing what she would say to her stepmother all day, and she did not want to miss a single word. "They are rather simple," she began. "The first condition is that you never approach me nor attempt to contact me. Should you need anything for the estate, inform one of the servants and I will consider your request." Her stepmother scowled. "Very well, I happily accept that condition. What else?" "There is only one other," Marie replied, though arguably it was the most important of the two. "You will promise that you will not get in the way of Harriet's happiness." Her stepmother stared at her. "What does that mean exactly?" Marie stepped forward, releasing Alexander's hand. She needed to appear intimidating and capable of holding her own. "You will not dictate how Harriet is to run her life," she hissed, "who she can see or who she falls in love with. As long as I live, I will defend her happiness, even against you." "It is truly the very least I can do for her." Bertha looked as though she wished to say something, no doubt some sort of vicious retort. But to Marie's surprise, she held her tongue. "Very well," she grumbled at length. "I suppose I have little choice in the matter if I want to continue to live here." "I'm glad you see reason," Marie said with a satisfied smile. "Now, Lord Greene and I must depart. We have a busy day ahead of us." "Of course, my lady." Bitterness dripped from Bertha's voice, but Marie paid it no mind. Together, she and Alexander walked out the door. As they made their way toward the front entrance of the house, Alexander cast her a glance. "Are you all right?" She nodded. "I am. I'm rather happy, to be honest." Though it was not, as he might suspect, because of Bertha. She was no longer scared of the woman, and though it was truly satisfying being the one to hold power over her now, she did not glean as much joy from the act itself as she had anticipated. No, instead, all she could think of was Alexander himself. Glancing up at him, she felt her heart swell with emotion. This man was her life. She could not wait to wake up to him every morning and have children with him someday soon. In comparison to her love for Alexander, her feelings toward Bertha were completely inconsequential. Alexander caught her staring up at him and playfully asked, "What is it, darling?" She grinned, adoring his little pet names for her. "I was just thinking how incredibly lucky I am to have you." "Oh, is that all?" He leaned down and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. She could not stop the giggle that escaped her. Her heart was so filled with joy, she had little room for hate. Let Bertha wallow in her loneliness and misery. Marie would be busy thriving with the love of her life. Epilogue. Alexander. "Are you certain you like it?" he asked, gazing around the foyer of the house with an arched brow. "Yes, I do, thank you." Harriet's eyes twinkled with delight as she answered him. "I think this will be a very fine place for you and Gerard," Marie, who stood at his side, declared with a wide smile. "You won't be disturbed here." He watched as his wife rested her hands over her rounding belly and smiled softly. "It is very kind of you to do this," Harriet suddenly said, snagging his attention from his pregnant wife. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." He waved her words away and shook his head. "There's no need to repay me. If anything, I'm in your debt. Had it not been for you, I might not have Marie with me today." Harriet glanced toward her stepsister and then nodded once a playful smirk curled her lips. "I suppose that is true enough," she said, shooting him a wink. "But still, this is very generous of you." "It is nothing," he assured her. If it helped her escape her mother's clutches, Alexander would happily provide her 10 estates she could call her own. "Why don't you continue looking around a bit?" Marie suggested. "Gerard should be here shortly, I believe. You can be prepared with your opinion of the place." Harriet smiled and nodded. "Thank you again, both of you." Alexander waited until she had wandered down the hall away from the foyer before he slipped an arm around his wife's waist. "Are you pleased, darling?" he asked, pulling her against him. "Are you happy to be able to help your stepsister in this way?" Marie nodded, clutching at his jacket as she gazed up at him. "I am. Very happy," she replied. "I think this will make a fine home for Harriet and Gerard once they are married this Sunday. They shouldn't have to live under the same roof as Bertha." The woman was misery incarnate, but she had kept her word and not reached out directly to Marie in the year since they had allowed her to remain on the Dunwich estate. He knew it bothered Marie, deep down, that that woman continued to live in her family's home. His wife was a generous, forgiving soul, however, and she would not feel right about throwing the woman from the property, as Alexander personally believed she deserved. "You are an angel. You know that, don't you?" he murmured, leaning down to press his forehead to hers. She closed her eyes and let out a sigh of contentment. "I don't know if that's entirely true, but I appreciate the sentiment." He chuckled. "My practical, level-headed wife. Every day I give thanks that you are mine. I don't know what my life would be without you." "Nor mine without you," she confessed softly, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "You are my dream I didn't know could come true." "And you're my heart," he replied. "Everything I am and have is and will always be yours." With those words he leaned down and kissed her, reveling in her sweetness. After everything they had overcome to reach this point, he sometimes wondered if they were not fated for each other, if they had not always been meant to be. It was strange to think about how a simple misunderstanding could lead to such bliss and love in his life. For as long as he lived, Alexander would remember the night when they had first met. He had thought her someone else, but his heart and soul had always recognized her for who she truly was. What had started as the simple urge to attend a ball had altered their lives forever, and if Alexander were given a choice to go back and do it all again, he would not change a thing. It had all brought him to her.
Click on the link in the description to read the next book in the series. Share this video with your friend or watch on of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.